Good evening, and welcome back to Bedtime and Historian. The story we are beginning tonight is not only the story of a single man, but of a century that moved quickly, sometimes recklessly, and often without pause. It is the story of John F. Kennedy, but it is also the story of the world that shaped him long before he ever spoke into a microphone, long before crowds gathered, long before history froze his image into something almost timeless. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you'd like, let me know where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is where you are. Some of you may be winding down after a long day. Others may be listening as the world outside grows quiet. Wherever you are, you're welcome here. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. John Fitzgerald Kennedy was born into a world that was already trembling with change. He arrived on the 29th of May 1917 in Brookline, Massachusetts, during a time when the United States was still adjusting to its role on the global stage. The country had entered the First World War only weeks earlier. Newspapers were filled with reports from Europe. Maps were being redrawn even as soldiers crossed oceans. The idea that America could remain distant from global conflict was already fading. The Kennedy family into which John was born was not an ordinary one. His father, Joseph P. Kennedy, was ambitious, energetic, and intensely focused on success. His mother, Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy, came from a prominent Boston political family, bringing with her a strong sense of duty, discipline, and Catholic faith. From the beginning, expectations were not subtle in the Kennedy household. Achievement was assumed. Failure was quietly discouraged. Public service was admired, but always alongside the pursuit of influence and recognition. Yet despite the wealth and visibility of his family, John's early years were not marked by strength or confidence. He was a small, often sickly child. Illness followed him throughout his youth in ways that were unpredictable and sometimes severe. Scarlet fever nearly took his life when he was young. Chronic pain, digestive issues, and fatigue became familiar companions. Even as the family moved between homes and schools, adjusting to their growing status, John remained physically fragile. This contrast between privilege and vulnerability would quietly shape him. While his older brother, Joseph Jr., appeared stronger and more naturally confident, John learned to observe, to listen, and to endure discomfort without complaint. He spent long periods confined to bed, reading extensively. History, biographies, and political writing filled his days. These were not idle distractions. They were, in many ways, his first introduction to the forces that move societies forward and pull them apart. The world outside the Kennedy home continued to shift. The 1920s brought economic expansion, cultural change, and optimism for many Americans. At the same time, deep inequalities remained. Immigration debates, racial segregation, and political corruption were not distant ideas. They were present realities shaping daily life. For families like the Kennedys, opportunity was abundant, but it came with an understanding that status had to be maintained and expanded. Joseph Kennedy's career took the family beyond Boston. His involvement in banking, film studios, and later diplomacy exposed his children to broader worlds. Dinner table conversations often revolved around politics, markets, international affairs, and ambition. Yet affection was measured, praise was limited, expectations were clear. In this environment, children were encouraged to compete, sometimes with each other, always with the world. As John moved through his teenage years, the global atmosphere darkened again. The Great Depression reshaped American life almost overnight. Financial instability touched nearly every household, though the Kennedys were largely insulated from its harshest effects. Still, the emotional impact of the era was unavoidable. Confidence in institutions weakened. Trust in leadership eroded. The idea that progress was guaranteed no longer felt certain. John attended a series of elite schools, not always fitting in easily. He was intelligent but inconsistent. Teachers noted his curiosity and wit, but also his frequent absences and uneven academic performance. His health issues continued to interrupt his education, forcing him to adapt constantly. This pattern of interruption, recovery, and persistence would follow him throughout his life. In the background, political ideologies were hardening across Europe. Fascism was rising. Democracies struggled. The Treaty of Versailles had failed to secure lasting peace. Though John was still a student, these developments were not abstract. His father's growing involvement in foreign affairs meant that international tensions were often discussed close to home. By the time John entered Harvard University in the mid-1930s, the world was again approaching conflict. At Harvard, he studied government and international relations, gravitating toward questions of power, leadership, and responsibility. His senior thesis examined British unpreparedness in the face of Nazi aggression, a topic that reflected his growing awareness of how complacency and miscalculation could alter history. This was not merely an academic exercise. Europe was already at war when he completed his studies. Democracies were under pressure. Alliances were fragile. The United States remained officially neutral, but few believed that distance would provide lasting protection. For young men of John's generation, the future was increasingly uncertain. Despite his fragile health, John felt compelled to serve. When the United States entered World War II after the attack on Pearl Harbor, he sought active duty. His determination to participate was not universally supported. His medical history raised concerns, yet persistence, combined with family influence, eventually secured him a position in the Navy. This decision marked a turning point. The sheltered environment of elite education gave way to the disciplined, demanding structure of military life. It was here, amid uncertainty and risk, that John's public reputation would begin to form, though he could not have known it at the time. The war reshaped him, but it also reshaped the nation. American identity was changing. The idea of collective responsibility gained strength. Sacrifice became normalized. For those who lived through it, the war was not simply a historical event. It was an experience that redefined expectations of leadership and service. As John navigated the challenges of military life, the contrast between his physical limitations and his sense of duty became sharper. Pain and illness did not disappear. They were managed, endured, and often concealed. This habit of concealment, of presenting calm while managing private difficulty, would later become one of the defining characteristics of his public life. By the time the war ended, John Fitzgerald Kennedy was no longer simply the younger son of a wealthy family. He had been tested by events larger than himself. The world he returned to was changed, and so was he. America emerged from the war as a global power, facing new responsibilities and new fears. The atomic age had begun. The Cold War was already taking shape. This was the world into which John would step as an adult, carrying with him the influences of family ambition, personal fragility, intellectual curiosity, and lived experience. The stage was being set not by destiny, not by inevitability, but by the slow accumulation of choices, pressures, and historical forces. And as the post-war years unfolded, the path ahead would demand more from him than anyone yet imagined. A privileged but fragile boy, John Fitzgerald Kennedy's early life unfolded inside comfort, routine, and expectation. Yet it was also shaped by weakness, uncertainty, and long stretches of enforced stillness. To understand the adult he became, it is necessary to linger in these quieter years, where the foundations of endurance, observation, and restraint were laid slowly, without drama. The Kennedy household was orderly and demanding. Rose Kennedy managed the home with precision, guided by a firm Catholic faith and a belief that discipline was a form of love. Schedules mattered. Behavior mattered. Children were expected to perform well, to carry themselves properly, and to represent the family with dignity. Emotional expression was limited. Praise was rare. Approval, when given, was measured. Joseph Kennedy, meanwhile, was frequently absent, occupied with business ventures and later with political ambitions. When he was present, he brought energy and expectation with him. He admired strength, decisiveness, and success. In his worldview, achievement was not optional. It was the natural outcome of effort and intelligence. His children absorbed this understanding early, often without being explicitly told. John, known within the family as Jack, did not fit easily into the image of effortless strength. From infancy, his health was unpredictable. He was often pale, thin, and easily fatigued. Childhood illnesses that passed quickly for others lingered with him. Scarlet fever nearly claimed his life, forcing weeks of isolation and recovery. Doctors were frequently consulted. Treatments were invasive by modern standards and often ineffective. These experiences separated John from the rhythms of ordinary childhood. While his siblings played, competed, and travelled with ease, he spent long hours indoors, resting, reading, or simply waiting for pain to subside. This isolation was not presented as tragedy within the family. It was accepted quietly, almost matter-of-factly. Endurance was expected, not sympathy. Reading became his refuge. Books filled the space where physical activity could not. History fascinated him. He gravitated towards stories of nations rising and falling, leaders navigating crises, and societies confronting change. These were not escapist fantasies. They were examinations of how people behaved under pressure. Even as a boy, John seemed less interested in heroes than in consequences. At school, he was intelligent but inconsistent. Teachers noted his sharp observations and dry humour, but also his frequent absences and uneven performance. He could be charming, even witty, yet he rarely dominated attention. Unlike some of his siblings, he did not seek the spotlight naturally. Instead, he learned how to move within it carefully, conserving energy and choosing moments deliberately. The Kennedy children were encouraged to compete, though not always openly. Comparisons were inevitable. John's older brother, Joseph Jr., embodied many of the qualities their father admired most: physical confidence, ambition, and outward certainty. Joe Jr. was groomed, both subtly and explicitly, as the family's future standard-bearer. John understood this without resentment, accepting his role as secondary, at least for the time being. This position offered him a kind of freedom. Without the weight of primary expectation, he was able to observe more than perform. He watched how authority functioned within his own household, how approval was earned, and how disappointment was absorbed without complaint. These lessons were quiet, but they were persistent. As the family moved between homes in Massachusetts and spent time travelling, John's awareness of social structure sharpened. He recognized privilege not as an abstract concept, but as a daily reality. Doors opened easily for his family. Opportunities appeared without effort. Yet he also noticed the obligations that accompanied status. Reputation mattered. Mistakes carried consequences beyond the personal. The broader world intruded gradually. The late 1920s and early 1930s were marked by economic collapse and social anxiety. Though the Kennedy family was financially secure, the atmosphere of uncertainty could not be entirely avoided. Conversations about markets, employment, and political instability filtered into domestic life. John listened more than he spoke. His schooling continued at a series of elite institutions, each reinforcing discipline and expectation. He adapted, sometimes struggling, sometimes excelling, but always aware that performance was being measured. His health remained a limiting factor. Back pain, digestive problems, and chronic fatigue followed him. Through adolescence, treatments offered little relief. Pain became something to manage privately. This habit of concealment deepened. John learned not to burden others with his discomfort. Complaints were discouraged, implicitly if not explicitly. In a family that valued strength, vulnerability was tolerated but not indulged. He internalized this standard, presenting calm even when exhausted or unwell. Despite these limitations, he developed a keen sense of humour. It was dry, understated, often self-directed. Humour allowed him to deflect attention without confrontation, to participate socially without overexertion. It also served as a subtle form of control, shaping interactions gently rather than forcefully. As adolescence gave way to early adulthood, John became increasingly aware of the world beyond his immediate surroundings. International events captured his attention. Political movements abroad, especially in Europe, seemed to him both distant and relevant. He followed news reports with interest, not alarm, curious about how instability developed and how leaders responded. The influence of his parents remained strong, though expressed differently. From his mother, he absorbed discipline and moral framing. From his father, he inherited an interest in power, strategy, and public life. Yet he did not simply imitate either. Instead, he blended observation with restraint, forming an identity that was quieter, less obvious, but carefully calibrated. By the time he approached college age, John Kennedy had already learned several lessons that would define his future. He understood that strength was not always visible. He knew that pain could be endured without acknowledgement. He recognized that authority often rested on perception as much as reality, and he had learned to wait. This capacity for waiting developed through illness, observation, and secondary status was perhaps his most important early skill. While others acted quickly, John considered. While others asserted, he listened. These habits did not make him passive, they made him deliberate. The world he was preparing to enter was not gentle. Economic instability persisted. Political ideologies hardened. The possibility of large-scale conflict grew increasingly real. John did not yet know how directly these forces would shape his life, but he sensed that history was accelerating. His childhood and youth had not been dramatic in the conventional sense. There were no defining rebellions, no grand gestures. Instead, there was continuity, of expectation, of illness, of observation. These years formed a foundation that was invisible to most, yet essential to everything that followed. As he moved forward, carrying both privilege and fragility, he did so quietly, without announcing intention or ambition. The transformation ahead would not be sudden. It would be shaped by circumstance, pressure, and choice, each building upon the careful endurance learned early in life. War, survival, and character. When John Kennedy entered military service during the Second World War, he did not do so as a figure of destiny or symbolism. He entered as a young man shaped by privilege, illness, and a careful awareness of his own limits, stepping into a conflict that was already immense and impersonal. The war did not need him, and it did not pause for him. It simply absorbed him, as it did millions of others, and in doing so, altered him in ways that would matter long after the fighting ended. The United States' entry into the war in December 1941 changed the pace of American life almost overnight. Neutrality was no longer a position that could be defended. The attack on Pearl Harbor brought clarity where uncertainty had lingered. Mobilization was rapid, widespread, and demanding. Young men were called to serve, and expectations of participation became nearly universal. For Kennedy, the decision to join was not automatic. His medical history raised serious concerns. Chronic back pain, digestive disorders, and recurring infections were well documented. Doctors had often advised caution. There were moments when military service seemed unlikely, perhaps even impossible. Yet Kennedy persisted, aided by determination and by his family's influence. He did not seek exemption, he sought inclusion. He was eventually commissioned as an officer in the U.S. Navy, assigned to patrol torpedo boats in the Pacific. These small, fast vessels were used in dangerous coastal operations, often at night, often close to enemy-controlled waters. Service on a PT boat was physically demanding and mentally exhausting. There was little glamour in it, and little margin for error. The Pacific theatre differed sharply from the war in Europe. Distances were vast, conditions were harsh. Heat, humidity, and disease were constant adversaries. Supply lines were long and fragile. Combat was unpredictable, frequently sudden, and often confusing. For officers and crew alike, survival depended on coordination, discipline, and luck. Kennedy was assigned to PT 109, a boat operating in the Solomon Islands in 1943. As a commanding officer, he was responsible for both navigation and crew welfare. Leadership in this context was not abstract. It involved managing fatigue, fear, and uncertainty, often without clear guidance. Orders were sometimes incomplete. Intelligence was imperfect. Decisions had to be made quickly, based on limited information. On the night of the 2nd of August 1943, PT 109 was patrolling a narrow stretch of water when it was struck by a Japanese destroyer. The collision was sudden and devastating. The larger ship cut the smaller PT boat in half. 2 crew members were killed instantly. The remaining men were thrown into the water amid darkness, debris, and burning fuel. What followed was not a cinematic sequence of heroism. It was disorientation, pain, and uncertainty. Kennedy himself was injured, his back further damaged by the impact. The surviving crew clung to wreckage in open water, unsure of their location or prospects. There was no immediate rescue. The danger of enemy patrols remained. Kennedy assumed responsibility without dramatics. He gathered the survivors and made decisions aimed at preserving life, not reputation. Over the following hours and days, he helped guide the men to nearby islands, swimming long distances while assisting those who were wounded or exhausted. At one point, he towed an injured crewman by gripping the strap of the man's life jacket between his teeth, an action that was later recounted often, though Kennedy himself rarely emphasized it. The group eventually reached a small, uninhabited island. Supplies were minimal, food and water were scarce. Exposure and exhaustion compounded injuries. Kennedy took on the task of seeking help, swimming through dangerous waters to reach other islands, leaving messages carved into coconuts and coordinating with local islanders. These efforts eventually led to the crew's rescue. The incident did not immediately define Kennedy's public image. At the time, it was one of countless wartime episodes involving survival and loss, yet within the military, his actions were recognized. He received the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for heroism and the Purple Heart for injuries sustained. More importantly, the experience left a lasting imprint on his understanding of responsibility. The war did not make Kennedy fearless. It did not transform him into a natural warrior. What it did was confirm patterns already present in his character. He remained calm under pressure. He prioritized others over himself. He accepted physical pain as a condition of duty, not as something requiring explanation. At the same time, the war intensified his health struggles. His back injury worsened. Chronic pain became more severe and persistent. Medical interventions followed, including surgeries that provided limited relief and sometimes introduced new complications. These conditions would follow him for the rest of his life, often hidden behind controlled posture and composed expression. When Kennedy returned home after the war, the country he re-entered was not the one he had left. The United States emerged as a global power, facing responsibilities that extended far beyond its borders. The optimism of victory was tempered by new anxieties. The use of atomic weapons introduced fears that were difficult to articulate and impossible to ignore. For Kennedy, personally, the war altered his position within his family. His older brother, Joseph Jr., had been killed in combat in 1944. Joe Jr. had been widely regarded as the future of the Kennedy family's political ambitions. His death reshaped expectations quietly but profoundly. Without public announcement or formal discussion, the weight of future possibility shifted. Kennedy did not immediately step forward to claim this role. He returned to civilian life uncertain of his direction, managing ongoing health issues while observing a rapidly changing political landscape. Yet the war had given him credibility that could not be manufactured. He was no longer simply a well-connected young man. He was a veteran who had experienced risk, loss, and responsibility firsthand. The broader cultural context reinforced this shift. Veterans were returning to education through the GI Bill, entering politics, business, and public service. Military experience became a shared reference point for a generation. It carried expectations of seriousness and sacrifice. Kennedy fit into this pattern quietly, without exaggeration. His wartime experience also sharpened his skepticism towards simplistic narratives. He had seen how decisions made far from the front could carry heavy consequences. He understood how miscalculation and incomplete information could lead to catastrophe. These lessons did not make him cynical, they made him cautious. The war years had not resolved his physical fragility, but they had clarified his resilience. Pain did not disappear. It became structured around purpose. Responsibility provided a framework within which discomfort could be endured without complaint. As Kennedy began to consider his future, the war remained present in his thinking, not as a heroic chapter, but as a reminder of complexity. Leadership, he had learned, often involved choosing among imperfect options, under conditions that offered little certainty and no ideal outcomes. These insights would not immediately propel him into public life. They settled gradually, influencing how he approached opportunity and risk. The man who emerged from the war was not dramatically different from the one who entered it. He was more defined. The conflict had stripped away any lingering illusions about ease or inevitability. It had introduced him to responsibility under pressure, to decision-making without guarantees, and to the enduring consequences of action and inaction alike. As the post-war years unfolded, these lessons would quietly inform his choices. They would shape his approach to politics, to foreign policy, and to leadership itself. The war did not make him who he was, but it revealed who he could be. And as history moved forward, the memory of those nights in the Pacific, the weight of command in uncertainty, and the cost of misjudgment would remain with him, often unseen, always present, returning to a changed America. When John Fitzgerald Kennedy returned from the war, he did not arrive home as a conquering figure or a public hero. He returned quietly, carrying injuries that would not fully heal, and entering a country that was itself trying to understand what it had become. The war had ended, but it had not concluded neatly. Its effects lingered in institutions, in families, and in expectations about the future. The United States in the late 1940s was confident and unsettled at the same time. Economically, the country was expanding. Industry that had been mobilized for war was being redirected towards civilian life. Suburbs were beginning to grow. Education and home ownership expanded rapidly, especially for veterans. There was optimism, but it was paired with unease. The atomic age had arrived, and with it the awareness that future conflicts could unfold on a scale previously unimaginable. Kennedy entered this world at a personal crossroads. His military service had ended, but his health remained uncertain. The injuries sustained during the war, particularly to his back, required ongoing treatment. Pain was frequent and unpredictable. Medical advice was inconsistent. Some doctors encouraged rest and caution. Others proposed aggressive interventions that promised improvement, but often delivered only temporary relief. Despite these challenges, there was little appetite for retreat. The Kennedy family was already recalibrating its future. Joseph Kennedy Sr. had envisioned his eldest son as the family's political standard-bearer. With Joe Jr.'s death, that expectation dissolved without formal acknowledgement. There was no public declaration of succession, no announcement of new plans. Instead, attention shifted gradually, almost imperceptibly, toward John. This shift brought opportunity and pressure in equal measure. John did not immediately embrace the idea of a political career. He explored journalism briefly, working as a reporter and considering the possibility of writing. His curiosity about international affairs remained strong. He travelled, observed, and listened. These activities were not diversions. They were extensions of his long-standing habit of studying systems before engaging them. At the same time, his father's influence grew more direct. Joseph Kennedy believed strongly that public life offered the most meaningful path to influence and legacy. He also understood politics as a practical endeavour, shaped by timing, alliances, and image. For him, ambition was not something to be discovered. It was something to be applied. Kennedy absorbed these ideas without fully adopting their urgency. His approach remained measured. He was aware of his limitations, both physical and experiential. He understood that public life demanded stamina, consistency, and resilience. These were not qualities he assumed lightly. Yet the environment of post-war America created openings that did not exist before. Veterans were respected. Youth was increasingly valued. There was a hunger for leaders who seemed both competent and modern. Kennedy fit this image in ways that were not immediately obvious, but became clearer with time. He began to consider a run for public office in Massachusetts. The decision was not driven by ideology alone. It was shaped by opportunity, family support, and the recognition that his experiences, both wartime and personal, gave him credibility. He did not present himself as a radical reformer or a traditional machine politician. Instead, he positioned himself as thoughtful, informed, and reliable. The political landscape he entered was complex. Massachusetts politics were dominated by established figures and entrenched interests. Ethnic and religious identities mattered. As a Catholic, Kennedy faced both loyalty and suspicion. While Catholic voters often supported candidates from their own communities, there remained underlying prejudice, especially among older Protestant voters. Kennedy navigated these dynamics carefully. He did not foreground his religious identity, nor did he conceal it. Instead, he emphasized shared concerns: economic stability, veterans' issues, and effective governance. His style was calm and understated. He avoided confrontational rhetoric. This approach reflected both temperament and strategy. Campaigning took a physical toll. Travel, public appearances, and long days exacerbated his health problems. Pain management became part of daily routine. Yet he rarely allowed these struggles to become visible. The discipline learned in childhood and reinforced during the war now served him well. When Kennedy ran for Congress in 1946, he faced an experienced opponent. The campaign required organization, resources, and persistence. Joseph Kennedy provided substantial support, both financial and logistical. This assistance was not hidden, but it was not emphasized. John remained the face of the effort, engaging voters directly. He won the election, entering the House of Representatives as one of the youngest members. His victory was not interpreted as revolutionary. It was seen as the emergence of a capable, well-connected newcomer. Expectations were modest. He was not immediately viewed as a national figure. In Congress, Kennedy adopted a cautious approach. He did not seek the spotlight aggressively. He focused on learning the institution, understanding procedures, and building relationships. His voting record reflected a mix of party loyalty and independent judgment. He supported labor interests at times and national security measures at others. The early Cold War context influenced nearly every aspect of political life. Relations with the Soviet Union deteriorated rapidly. The Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan signaled a new era of American engagement abroad. Anti-communist sentiment grew, sometimes rationally, sometimes excessively. Loyalty became a dominant theme. Kennedy observed these developments closely. He supported efforts to contain Soviet influence but expressed concern about rigidity and overreach. His wartime experiences had made him wary of decisions driven by fear rather than analysis. This perspective did not make him an outlier, but it distinguished him from more ideologically driven colleagues. His health continued to intrude. Hospitalizations were periodic. Recovery was slow. At times, there were doubts about whether he could sustain a long-term political career. These concerns were discussed privately within the family, but rarely acknowledged publicly. To the outside world, Kennedy appeared composed and capable. Over time, his confidence grew. He became more comfortable speaking publicly, more adept at navigating political compromise. His wit, once used primarily as a defense mechanism, became a subtle asset. He could disarm opponents without confrontation, express criticism without hostility. The House years also deepened his understanding of domestic issues. Housing shortages, labor disputes, and veterans' benefits required attention. He approached these topics pragmatically, informed by constituent needs rather than abstract ideology. This focus reinforced his reputation as a serious legislator. As he gained experience, his ambitions expanded cautiously. The Senate beckoned as a more influential platform. A run would require broader support, greater resources, and increased visibility. It would also demand sustained physical endurance. By the early 1950s, Kennedy decided to pursue this next step. The campaign was challenging. He faced strong opposition within his own party and skepticism from voters unfamiliar with his record. Once again, organization and persistence proved decisive. He traveled extensively, spoke steadily, and avoided unnecessary controversy. His election to the Senate marked a significant transition. It elevated him from regional figure to national presence. Expectations increased. Scrutiny intensified. His private struggles continued, but his public role expanded. In the Senate, Kennedy refined his identity further. He did not align himself rigidly with any single faction. Instead, he cultivated an image of thoughtful independence. He supported civil rights legislation selectively, balancing moral considerations with political realities. He remained attentive to foreign policy, recognizing its growing importance. During this period, he also published a book, Profiles in Courage, which examined acts of political bravery in American history. The work reflected his ongoing interest in leadership under pressure and the tension between principle and expedience. Its success enhanced his reputation as an intellectual as well as a politician. Behind the scenes, health crises persisted. Surgical interventions multiplied. Recovery periods were difficult. Pain management required constant attention. Yet these challenges did not derail his trajectory. They were managed, compartmentalized, and endured. The United States itself was changing rapidly. Television began to reshape political communication. Public expectations of leaders evolved. Youthfulness, composure, and clarity gained value. Kennedy's demeanor, shaped by years of restraint, suited this environment. By the mid-1950s, he was no longer merely a promising figure. He was a serious contender in national politics. Observers began to consider his potential for higher office, though doubts remained. His religion, health, and relatively limited experience were cited as obstacles. Kennedy acknowledged these challenges without dramatizing them. He continued to build relationships, refine his positions, and prepare quietly. He did not rush. He understood that timing mattered. Returning from the war had not launched him immediately into prominence. Instead, it initiated a gradual process of adaptation, learning, and positioning. The man who emerged was neither fully transformed nor unchanged. He was shaped by experience, informed by observation, and prepared to engage a world that demanded careful leadership. As the Cold War intensified and domestic pressures mounted, Kennedy's path forward became clearer. The changed America he had returned to was still evolving, and within it, his role was still taking shape, entering politics carefully. By the time John Fitzgerald Kennedy settled into his role in the United States Senate, his entry into politics no longer appeared accidental or provisional. Yet it would be misleading to describe his rise as sudden or impulsive. It was, instead, the result of deliberate positioning, careful pacing, and a steady accumulation of experience shaped by both opportunity and constraint. Kennedy approached politics much as he had approached illness and military service, with restraint, attention to detail, and a reluctance to dramatize his own efforts. He did not attempt to redefine the Senate or challenge its traditions directly. He learned its rhythms, its hierarchies, and its informal rules. This patience was not passivity. It was a strategic choice, grounded in observation. The Senate of the early 1950s was a powerful institution dominated by seniority. Long-serving members wielded significant influence over committees and legislation. Younger senators were expected to listen before speaking and to demonstrate loyalty before independence. Kennedy understood this structure quickly. Rather than seeking immediate prominence, he focused on building credibility among colleagues. His committee assignments reflected this approach. He took particular interest in foreign relations and labor issues, both of which aligned with his existing interests and with the evolving concerns of the nation. The Cold War framed nearly every discussion of foreign policy. Decisions about alliances, military spending, and economic aid were no longer abstract debates. They were central to national identity. Kennedy's perspective on these matters was shaped by wartime experience and academic study rather than ideology alone. He supported American engagement abroad, but remained cautious about rigid thinking. He recognized that global politics involved competing interests and cultural differences that could not be resolved through force alone. This nuanced position sometimes placed him at odds with more strident voices, but it also distinguished him as thoughtful. Domestically, labor relations were a persistent concern. Post-war economic growth had not eliminated conflict between workers and management. Strikes, wage disputes, and questions about union power were common. Kennedy navigated these issues with attention to balance. He supported workers' rights while acknowledging the importance of economic stability. His votes reflected moderation rather than partisanship. Throughout this period, his health remained a constant challenge. Senate schedules were demanding, involving long sessions, travel, and frequent public appearances. Kennedy's back pain intensified at times, requiring hospitalization and surgery. Recovery periods were often private and prolonged. During these intervals, he relied on aides and family members to manage responsibilities. These absences occasionally raised questions about his durability. Critics wondered whether he could sustain a national role. Supporters emphasized his resilience and discipline. Kennedy himself rarely addressed the issue publicly. He understood that visibility of weakness could become political vulnerability. Instead, he maintained composure, presenting steadiness, even when under strain. His public speaking evolved gradually. Early speeches were measured and carefully prepared. He avoided flamboyant rhetoric, preferring clarity and concision. Over time, his delivery became more confident. He learned how to adapt tone to audience without abandoning substance. This skill would later prove crucial as media exposure increased. The publication of Profiles in Courage marked an important moment in his Senate career. The book explored instances in which American politicians had taken principled stands at personal or political cost. It reflected Kennedy's ongoing interest in the tension between conscience and expedience. While the book was presented as a historical study, it also served as a quiet statement about leadership. The book's success broadened his audience beyond Massachusetts. It introduced him to readers who might otherwise have had little awareness of his work. The accompanying attention reinforced his image as an intellectual figure, capable of reflection as well as action. Awards and recognition followed, further enhancing his national profile. At the same time, Kennedy remained attentive to his constituency. He continued to address local concerns, maintain connections with Massachusetts voters, and ensure that his presence was felt at home, even as his influence expanded. This balance between local loyalty and national ambition was carefully managed. The political climate of the 1950s was marked by anxiety and conformity. Anti-communist sentiment dominated public discourse. Loyalty investigations and public accusations were common. Many politicians adopted cautious positions, avoiding statements that could be interpreted as sympathetic to dissent. Kennedy navigated this environment with care. He supported national security measures while expressing concern about excesses. He avoided aligning himself fully with the most aggressive anti-communist figures, recognizing the long-term risks of fear-driven policy. This stance required restraint, particularly given the popularity of hardline positions. His Catholic faith continued to shape perceptions. While religious prejudice had softened since his congressional campaigns, it had not disappeared. Kennedy chose not to foreground religion in his political identity. Instead, he emphasized constitutional principles and shared civic values. This approach allowed him to connect with a broader electorate without denying personal beliefs. Behind the scenes, his family remained deeply involved in his career. Joseph Kennedy Sr. continued to provide guidance, resources, and encouragement. He understood the mechanics of power and the importance of timing. His influence was sometimes criticized as excessive, but it was undeniably effective. Kennedy accepted this support while maintaining a public image of independence. As Kennedy's confidence grew, so did speculation about his future. Observers began to discuss his potential as a presidential candidate. These conversations were often tentative, framed as possibilities rather than predictions. Doubts persisted regarding his age, experience, health, and religious background. Kennedy did not dismiss these doubts. He assessed them carefully. He recognized that ambition without preparation could be damaging. Rather than announcing intention prematurely, he continued to build credentials. He traveled abroad, meeting foreign leaders and studying international conditions firsthand. These trips informed his understanding of global politics and reinforced his credibility. At home, he refined his policy positions. He sought input from experts, advisors, and colleagues. He listened more than he spoke in private discussions, absorbing perspectives and weighing alternatives. This methodical approach contrasted with more impulsive styles and reinforced his reputation for seriousness. The Senate years also brought personal developments. He married Jacqueline Bouvier in 1953, an event that attracted public attention. Their partnership, though private in many respects, became part of his public image. Jacqueline's intelligence, poise, and cultural interests complemented Kennedy's demeanor. Together, they represented a modern, cosmopolitan image that resonated with changing public tastes. Despite appearances, personal life did not alleviate pressure. Health concerns persisted. The demands of public office intensified. Expectations grew. Yet Kennedy maintained a steady pace, neither retreating nor accelerating recklessly. By the late 1950s, the possibility of a presidential campaign became more tangible. The Democratic Party was searching for leadership capable of responding to Cold War challenges and domestic change. The Eisenhower administration, while stable, was aging. A sense of generational transition began to emerge. Kennedy recognized this moment. He understood that the political environment was shifting, opening space for new voices. He also knew that success would require careful organization, coalition building, and image management. His approach to entering politics had always been cautious, and it remained so as he considered this next step. Entering politics carefully had allowed Kennedy to survive and advance despite obstacles. It had given him time to learn, to adapt, and to prepare. It had also shaped his public persona as measured, thoughtful, and composed. As the decade drew to a close, Kennedy stood at the threshold of national leadership. He had not rushed to this point. He had arrived through patience and persistence, shaped by experience rather than impulse. The choices ahead would test everything he had learned, and the careful entry that had defined his rise would soon give way to decisions made under far greater scrutiny and pressure. The Senate and national attention. By the late 1950s, John Fitzgerald Kennedy was no longer simply a junior senator learning the contours of Washington life. His years in the Senate had given him visibility, experience, and a growing sense of how national power actually functioned. Attention began to shift toward him not because of a single speech or vote, but because he seemed to represent something quietly different from many of his contemporaries. The Senate was still governed by tradition and seniority, but it was also becoming more visible to the public. Television coverage increased. Political reporting expanded. Senators were no longer known only to their states or to specialists. National reputations could now be formed more quickly, shaped by image as much as by record. Kennedy understood this development intuitively. He did not resist it, but neither did he embrace it recklessly. His legislative record during this period was steady rather than spectacular. He continued to support foreign aid programs aimed at stabilizing allies and limiting Soviet influence, arguing that economic support could prevent future conflicts more effectively than military intervention alone. This view reflected a growing belief that American leadership required flexibility and long-term planning, not just displays of force. At the same time, he remained attentive to domestic policy. Housing, education, and labor conditions remained pressing concerns. Kennedy supported measures designed to expand access to education and improve working conditions, particularly for veterans and working families. He framed these issues not as ideological battles, but as practical investments in national stability. Civil rights posed a more complicated challenge. The issue was gaining national attention, driven by court decisions, grassroots activism, and increasing media coverage of racial violence and segregation. Kennedy approached the topic with caution. He expressed moral concern and supported incremental progress, but he was also aware of the political risks involved, particularly within his party. Southern Democrats wielded considerable influence, and open confrontation could fracture fragile coalitions. This cautious approach attracted criticism from some activists, who viewed it as insufficient. Others saw it as politically realistic. Kennedy himself appeared to view civil rights as both a moral and strategic issue, one that required careful navigation rather than dramatic gestures. His position would continue to evolve, shaped by events and responsibilities that lay ahead. As his profile grew, so did scrutiny of his personal life and health. Rumors circulated about his medical condition, fueled by periodic absences and hospitalizations. Kennedy worked diligently to maintain an image of vitality and composure. He scheduled public appearances carefully, managed rest periods discreetly, and relied heavily on aides to maintain continuity during recoveries. His ability to compartmentalize was remarkable. Pain did not disappear, but it was managed. Illness did not define him publicly, even when it dominated his private life. This separation between public calm and private strain became one of his most consistent traits. International travel further expanded his perspective. Kennedy visited Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, meeting with leaders and observing conditions firsthand. These trips reinforced his understanding that American influence was neither absolute nor always welcome. He saw how colonial legacies, economic disparity, and cultural differences shaped global politics. These experiences deepened his skepticism towards simplistic Cold War narratives. Back in Washington, he cultivated relationships with journalists, intellectuals, and policy experts. He listened closely, asking questions and absorbing information. His circle of advisors expanded, laying the groundwork for a future administration. These relationships were not built on loyalty alone, but on shared interest in thoughtful governance. The success of Profiles in Courage continued to enhance his reputation. The book's emphasis on principle resonated with readers during a period often characterized by conformity and caution. While critics debated the extent of Kennedy's authorship, the work nonetheless reinforced his image as a serious figure engaged with the moral dimensions of leadership. Public perception increasingly framed Kennedy as a representative of generational change. He was young by Senate standards, articulate, and outwardly composed. In contrast to older leaders shaped by earlier eras, he appeared modern, adaptable, and forward-looking. This perception mattered, particularly as the Eisenhower administration aged, and questions about future leadership grew more urgent. Within the Democratic Party, discussions about the next presidential election intensified. Potential candidates were assessed quietly. Kennedy's name appeared more frequently in these conversations. Support was not universal. Concerns persisted about his religion, health, and experience. Yet his appeal was undeniable. Kennedy approached these developments without public announcement or overt ambition. He continued to perform his Senate duties, travel, and build alliances. Privately, preparations began. Organization, fundraising, and strategy were discussed within trusted circles. His father remained influential, emphasizing discipline and planning. The national mood was shifting. The Cold War intensified. The Soviet Union launched Sputnik, raising fears about American technological lag. Anxiety about education, science, and defense grew. Kennedy responded by emphasizing the importance of innovation and investment in knowledge. He argued that national strength depended not only on military power, but on intellectual capacity. This message resonated. It aligned with emerging concerns and positioned Kennedy as a candidate attentive to future challenges. His speeches became slightly more assertive, though still measured. He began to articulate a vision that balanced caution with progress, realism with optimism. As attention increased, so did opposition. Rivals within the party questioned his readiness. Critics highlighted his absences and questioned his durability. Religious prejudice resurfaced in subtle and overt forms. Kennedy acknowledged these obstacles without defensiveness. He prepared to address them directly if necessary. The Senate years had transformed him. He was no longer simply observing history, he was participating in its shaping. He understood the weight of national responsibility and the complexity of leadership. His experiences had taught him that power required restraint and that credibility was earned gradually. By the end of the decade, Kennedy stood on the edge of a new phase. National attention had found him, not through spectacle but through consistency and presence. The careful habits formed in illness, war, and legislative life had prepared him for greater scrutiny. The path ahead would demand more visibility, more decisiveness, and more endurance than ever before. But the foundation had been laid, quietly and deliberately, within the halls of the Senate, the making of a presidential candidate. By the time the 1960 presidential election cycle began to take shape, John Fitzgerald Kennedy had crossed a threshold that was not marked by ceremony or announcement. He had become a plausible national candidate not through spectacle but through accumulation of experience, recognition, and quiet preparation. The making of a presidential candidate, in his case, was less a declaration than a gradual alignment of timing, perception, and readiness. The Democratic Party in the late 1950s was unsettled. After 2 terms of Republican leadership under Dwight D. Eisenhower, there was a growing sense that the country was ready for change, though there was little agreement on what form that change should take. Party leaders debated whether experience or freshness mattered more, whether continuity or renewal would best serve the nation in a rapidly evolving world. Kennedy entered this discussion indirectly. He did not present himself as a disruptor. Instead, he positioned himself as a capable inheritor of responsibility, someone prepared to manage Cold War realities without inflaming them. This posture appealed to voters who sought confidence without confrontation. Privately, planning intensified. Kennedy's team expanded to include policy experts, strategists, and organizers. These individuals were selected not simply for loyalty, but for competence and adaptability. The goal was to build an operation that could function smoothly under pressure, anticipate challenges, and respond quickly to developments. Fundraising was a central concern. National campaigns required substantial resources, and Kennedy benefited from family connections and established networks. Financial support allowed for early organization, travel, and communication. This advantage was acknowledged by critics, but it was also accepted as a practical reality of modern politics. Kennedy's campaign strategy emphasized presence. He traveled extensively, meeting voters in diverse regions. These appearances were not theatrical. They were structured, consistent, and designed to build familiarity. He listened carefully, responded thoughtfully, and avoided promises that could not be sustained. One of the central challenges he faced was skepticism about his experience. Critics argued that his Senate tenure, while respectable, did not equate to executive leadership. Kennedy responded by emphasizing judgment over longevity. He argued that the complexity of modern leadership required adaptability, not simply years in office. Religion remained a persistent issue. As a Catholic candidate, Kennedy confronted lingering prejudice directly. He addressed concerns publicly, asserting his commitment to constitutional principles and the separation of church and state. This approach was calm and deliberate. He did not seek confrontation but clarity. Health concerns also surfaced repeatedly. Rumours circulated, fueled by past hospitalizations and visible periods of rest. Kennedy did not deny his medical history outright, but he reframed the narrative by emphasizing resilience and performance. He continued to maintain a demanding schedule, demonstrating stamina through action rather than explanation. Media played an increasingly central role. Television, in particular, reshaped political communication. Kennedy understood its power intuitively. He did not rely on it exclusively, but he recognized that image, tone, and composure mattered more than ever before. His demeanor, controlled, articulate, and composed, translated well to the screen. As primary contests approached, Kennedy faced rivals with deeper roots in the party establishment. These competitors questioned his readiness and sought to frame him as an untested figure. Kennedy responded by engaging directly with voters, particularly in states where success could demonstrate broad appeal. His campaign emphasized themes of responsibility, progress, and national strength. These ideas were framed in practical terms, avoiding grand rhetoric. He spoke about education, defense, and economic vitality as interconnected challenges requiring thoughtful leadership. The process of becoming a presidential candidate required Kennedy to shift subtly but significantly. He moved from observation to assertion, from analysis to advocacy. This transition was not abrupt. It was calibrated carefully to avoid alienating supporters or provoking unnecessary opposition. As the campaign unfolded, Kennedy's confidence grew. He adapted to the pace of national politics, balancing preparation with responsiveness. His speeches became more assured, though still restrained. He demonstrated an ability to address complex issues clearly without oversimplification. The party's national convention approached with uncertainty. Kennedy entered as a leading contender but not a guaranteed nominee. Negotiations, alliances, and strategic decisions shaped the final outcome. Kennedy's team worked diligently to secure support, emphasizing unity and electability. When the nomination was secured, it marked the culmination of years of careful preparation. Yet it was not framed as a personal triumph. Kennedy presented it as a responsibility accepted rather than a victory claimed. This tone reinforced his public image as measured and serious. The making of a presidential candidate had required endurance, discipline, and restraint. Kennedy had navigated doubts about age, health, religion, and experience without dramatization. He had positioned himself as a steady presence in an uncertain time. As the general election loomed, the stakes increased. The campaign would test not only his ideas, but his composure under sustained scrutiny. The careful habits developed over years, listening, pacing, and managing strain, would now be tested on a national stage. The transformation was complete, though understated. John Fitzgerald Kennedy had become a presidential candidate not by declaring himself ready, but by demonstrating readiness through consistent action, television, debate, and victory. By the autumn of 1960, the American presidential campaign had entered unfamiliar territory. Elections had always involved speeches, rallies, newspapers, and radio, but now a newer medium stood at the center of public attention. Television was no longer a novelty. It had become a daily presence in millions of households, shaping how Americans absorbed information and judged public figures. For John Fitzgerald Kennedy, this change would matter profoundly. The general election campaign placed Kennedy opposite Vice President Richard Nixon, a seasoned political figure with deep experience in national and international affairs. Nixon was well known, widely respected within his party, and closely associated with the Eisenhower administration. On paper, he appeared formidable. He had spent years navigating complex policy challenges and had cultivated a reputation as tough, disciplined, and knowledgeable. Kennedy entered the contest with advantages and vulnerabilities. He was younger, less experienced in executive leadership, and still faced skepticism related to his religion and health. At the same time, he projected composure, clarity, and an ease with public presentation that resonated with a changing electorate. The contrast between the two candidates would become central to the campaign. Televised debates were proposed as a way for voters to see both candidates directly. This was a departure from tradition. Presidential debates had not been a standard feature of American elections for decades. The idea was controversial. Some worried that style would overshadow substance. Others believed it would democratize access to candidates. Both perspectives would prove accurate in different ways. Kennedy's campaign recognized the opportunity immediately. He understood that television rewarded calm, clarity, and visual presence. His years of managing physical discomfort had taught him how to project steadiness, even under strain. He prepared carefully, focusing not on memorization but on articulation. The goal was not to overwhelm viewers with information, but to appear capable, attentive, and composed. Nixon approached the debates differently. Recovering from illness and injury, he appeared tired and less comfortable on camera. His preparation emphasized content and argument rather than presentation. While radio listeners often judged Nixon the stronger debater, television viewers frequently reached a different conclusion. The first televised debate, held in September 1960, drew an enormous audience. Millions of Americans watched closely. Kennedy appeared relaxed, alert, and confident. He addressed questions directly, maintained eye contact with the camera, and spoke in measured tones. Nixon, by contrast, appeared tense and fatigued, his discomfort visible to viewers. This moment did not decide the election outright, but it altered perceptions. Kennedy was no longer an abstract figure or a distant senator. He was present in living rooms across the country, speaking calmly about national challenges. The image aligned with emerging expectations of leadership in a media-driven age. Subsequent debates reinforced this impression. Kennedy continued to perform consistently, avoiding dramatic gestures or sweeping claims. He framed issues such as national defense, economic growth, and global competition as interconnected responsibilities. He emphasized preparation and judgment over ideology. The campaign extended far beyond the debates. Kennedy traveled extensively, maintaining a demanding schedule that tested his endurance. Pain and fatigue were constant companions, managed through medication and rest whenever possible. Publicly, he appeared tireless. Privately, the effort required careful planning and discipline. Religion remained a central issue, particularly in certain regions. Kennedy addressed these concerns directly, most notably in a speech affirming his commitment to the separation of church and state. He framed his candidacy not as a test of religious identity, but as a question of constitutional principle. The speech was measured, clear, and direct. It reassured some voters and signaled seriousness to others. The Cold War loomed over every discussion. The Soviet Union's recent technological advances had heightened anxiety. Kennedy criticized what he described as complacency in American leadership, arguing that global competition required renewed focus on education, defense, and innovation. His tone was firm but controlled, emphasizing preparedness rather than alarm. Economic concerns also featured prominently. While the post-war economy had grown, pockets of unemployment and inequality persisted. Kennedy spoke about growth as a shared responsibility, requiring investment in infrastructure, science, and opportunity. He avoided sweeping promises, instead emphasizing practical steps and long-term thinking. Throughout the campaign, image and substance remained intertwined. Kennedy's calm demeanor reinforced his policy arguments. His youth suggested energy and adaptability. His restraint conveyed seriousness. These qualities contrasted with perceptions of stagnation associated with older leadership. Behind the scenes, the campaign was intensely organized. Volunteers coordinated logistics, messaging, and outreach. Fundraising continued at a high pace. Strategy meetings addressed shifting dynamics state by state. The margin for error was small, and the campaign operated with that understanding. Election day arrived amid uncertainty. Polls suggested a close contest. Turnout was high. Results came in slowly, reflecting the divided mood of the electorate. The final outcome was narrow. Kennedy secured victory by a slim margin in both the popular vote and the Electoral College. The result was historic. Kennedy became the youngest elected president in American history and the first Catholic to hold the office. The victory was not interpreted as a sweeping mandate. It was seen as a transition, a shift in tone and generation rather than ideology. Kennedy's response to victory reflected his character. He did not celebrate extravagantly. He acknowledged the closeness of the result and emphasized unity. He framed the election not as a personal triumph, but as a responsibility entrusted to him by the public. The role of television in the campaign left a lasting mark on American politics. The debates demonstrated that presentation could shape perception as powerfully as argument. Kennedy's success illustrated the importance of composure, clarity, and visual communication in modern leadership. Yet, it would be a mistake to attribute his victory solely to media. The debates amplified qualities that were already present. His careful preparation, steady demeanour, and thoughtful approach to policy had been shaped over years. Television revealed these traits. It did not create them. As the campaign ended and preparations for transition began, Kennedy faced the reality of what lay ahead. Victory brought expectation. The presidency would demand decisions far more consequential than those of the campaign trail. The calm that had served him well would soon be tested in ways no debate could simulate. The election of 1,960 marked a turning point not only for Kennedy, but for the country. It signaled a readiness for new leadership and a new style of communication. It also underscored how narrow the path to power could be in a divided nation. Kennedy entered the presidency aware of these complexities. He understood that public confidence could be fragile and that leadership required more than image. The campaign had demonstrated his ability to present himself effectively. Governing would demand far more. As he prepared to take office, the sense of transition deepened. The campaign had ended, but the challenges it had highlighted remained unresolved. The Cold War continued. Domestic pressures persisted. Expectations were high, but patience was uncertain. The victory was real, but it was also provisional. It granted authority, not certainty. Kennedy accepted it with the same measured seriousness that had defined his rise. The work ahead would reveal whether the calm confidence displayed on screen could translate into effective leadership in practice. A young president takes office. John Fitzgerald Kennedy entered the presidency at a moment when expectation felt heavier than celebration. The transition from candidate to president-elect unfolded quickly, leaving little time for reflection. The narrowness of the electoral victory underscored the reality that he would govern a divided country, one attentive to tone and competence, and alert to missteps. From the outset, Kennedy understood that the office he was about to assume was less a platform than a burden of responsibility. The weeks between the election and inauguration were filled with preparation. Briefings arrived daily, covering intelligence assessments, economic indicators, and diplomatic relationships. The scope of information was vast. Kennedy approached it methodically, reading extensively and asking pointed questions. He did not rush to impose direction. Instead, he sought to understand the machinery of government before attempting to move it. The outgoing administration provided continuity where possible. The Cold War demanded stability, and Kennedy was careful not to disrupt ongoing commitments prematurely. At the same time, he signaled an intention to bring new energy to the executive branch. This balance between continuity and change became a defining feature of the transition. Cabinet appointments drew immediate attention. Kennedy selected individuals who combined expertise with independence, favouring competence over ideological alignment. He assembled a team that reflected his belief in deliberation and debate. Advisors were encouraged to disagree openly, provided their arguments were grounded in evidence. This approach reflected lessons learned from history and war. Decisions made in isolation were often flawed. The inauguration itself was carefully planned but restrained. On the 20th of January 1961, Kennedy stood before the nation and delivered an address that emphasized responsibility, vigilance, and service. The speech was not designed to comfort through reassurance alone. It challenged Americans to engage with the demands of their time, yet the tone remained measured, avoiding exaggeration or confrontation. Behind the public ceremony lay immediate realities. The presidency offered no period of adjustment. Crises awaited attention from the first day. Intelligence reports detailed ongoing tensions in Europe, Asia, and the Caribbean. Domestic issues, including economic disparities and civil rights pressures, required careful handling. Kennedy moved into the White House aware that the pace would be relentless. The White House itself became a center of activity and expectation. Staff members adjusted to new routines. Advisors gathered frequently, exchanging ideas and concerns. Kennedy established a working style that emphasized concise briefings and focused discussion. He preferred clarity over volume, encouraging summaries that highlighted essential choices rather than exhaustive detail. Health considerations continued quietly in the background. The physical demands of the presidency were significant. Long hours, travel, and constant engagement exacerbated existing conditions. Kennedy managed these challenges discreetly, maintaining a public image of vitality. Rest and treatment were integrated into his schedule without acknowledgement. The discipline developed over years of illness proved essential. Foreign policy dominated early attention. The global landscape was unstable, shaped by decolonization, ideological competition, and unresolved conflicts. Kennedy recognized that American power was substantial but not absolute. He approached alliances with care, understanding that trust required consistency as much as strength. One of his earliest priorities was to reassess defense strategy. Military advisors presented scenarios emphasizing readiness and deterrence. Kennedy listened carefully, weighing recommendations against potential consequences. He questioned assumptions and sought alternatives that reduced the likelihood of escalation. This caution was not weakness. It was informed by awareness of nuclear realities. At home, economic concerns required attention. While growth continued, unemployment and inequality persisted in certain regions. Kennedy proposed measures aimed at stimulating investment and expanding opportunity. These proposals faced resistance from Congress, where partisan divisions and institutional inertia limited rapid action. Kennedy responded by negotiating, adjusting, and refining, rather than insisting on immediate outcomes. Civil rights remained a pressing issue, though Kennedy approached it cautiously during his first months. He recognized the moral urgency of the movement, but also the political constraints. His initial actions focused on enforcement of existing laws and support for judicial processes. This incremental approach drew criticism from activists seeking faster progress, yet Kennedy believed that sustainable change required careful groundwork. The early months of the administration were also shaped by symbolic choices. Kennedy emphasized cultural engagement, inviting artists, writers, and intellectuals to the White House. This emphasis signaled an appreciation for ideas and creativity as components of national strength. It also reinforced the image of a modern presidency attentive to broader dimensions of leadership. Media scrutiny intensified. Every gesture, statement, and decision was analyzed. Television coverage expanded, bringing the presidency into daily view. Kennedy adapted to this environment with composure. He understood that communication was itself a form of leadership. Press conferences became opportunities to explain policy, manage expectations, and project calm. The administration's internal dynamics reflected Kennedy's preference for deliberation. Advisors debated openly, sometimes vigorously. Decisions were rarely made impulsively. This process could be time-consuming, but Kennedy believed it reduced the risk of error. He accepted that leadership involved managing uncertainty rather than eliminating it. As spring approached, the sense of momentum grew. Legislative proposals advanced, though slowly. International relationships were reassessed. The administration began to articulate a broader vision that balanced caution with ambition. Kennedy spoke of progress not as a guarantee, but as a responsibility requiring effort and discipline. Despite the outward confidence, the presidency imposed a personal cost. Privacy diminished. Schedules became inflexible. Every movement was planned and protected. Kennedy adjusted, maintaining focus through routine and restraint. The habits formed in earlier life, managing pain, conserving energy, observing before acting, proved invaluable. The young president was acutely aware of history. He read accounts of previous administrations, noting how decisions made early could shape long-term outcomes. He sought to avoid dramatic gestures that lacked foundation. Instead, he emphasized preparation and adaptability. The public responded with a mix of enthusiasm and caution. Many were drawn to Kennedy's demeanor and intelligence. Others remained skeptical, watching closely for evidence of inexperience. Kennedy acknowledged this scrutiny implicitly, understanding that confidence must be earned through action rather than appearance. As the administration settled into its rhythm, challenges began to accumulate. International tensions showed little sign of easing. Domestic pressures persisted. The presidency revealed itself not as a position of control, but as a continuous negotiation among competing demands. Kennedy's early months in office demonstrated a commitment to measured leadership. He did not seek to redefine the presidency through force of personality alone. Instead, he worked within its constraints, attentive to complexity and consequence. The transition from campaign to governance was complete. The presidency had begun not with spectacle, but with steady engagement. The young president faced a world that offered no simple solutions, only choices with lasting implications. As events unfolded, the calm he projected would be tested repeatedly. The responsibilities of office would demand decisions that carried risks beyond calculation. Yet in these early days, Kennedy approached leadership as he always had, carefully, deliberately, and with an awareness that history rarely rewards haste. Foreign policy under pressure. From the earliest days of his presidency, John Fitzgerald Kennedy found that foreign policy did not wait patiently for orientation or adjustment. It arrived fully formed, carrying expectations shaped by decades of conflict and alliance, and demanding attention that could not be postponed. The Cold War framed nearly every decision. It was not a single conflict, but a condition of global life, influencing diplomacy, economics, and military planning across continents. Kennedy inherited a world defined by rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. This rivalry was ideological, strategic, and psychological. Each side viewed the other not simply as a competitor, but as a threat to its vision of political order. The existence of nuclear weapons amplified every calculation. Mistakes carried consequences that could not be contained geographically. Early briefings emphasized continuity. Alliances formed under previous administrations were to be maintained. Commitments to Europe, particularly through NATO, remained central. Kennedy understood the importance of reassurance. European allies, still recovering from war and facing division, needed to believe that American leadership was steady and reliable. At the same time, Kennedy recognized that global dynamics were shifting. Decolonization accelerated across Africa and Asia. New nations emerged, often fragile and searching for identity. These regions became arenas of competition, not because they sought conflict, but because both superpowers sought influence. Kennedy viewed this environment with caution. He believed that heavy-handed intervention could undermine long-term stability. His administration emphasized economic assistance and development as tools of foreign policy. Programs aimed at supporting education, infrastructure, and governance were expanded. Kennedy argued that poverty and instability created conditions ripe for ideological extremism. Addressing these root causes, he believed, was as important as military preparedness. Relations with Latin America occupied particular attention. Geographic proximity and historical involvement made the region strategically significant. Kennedy proposed initiatives designed to encourage reform and growth, seeking to reduce inequality and political unrest. These efforts were framed as partnerships rather than directives, though skepticism persisted among local leaders accustomed to external influence. Military advisors continued to emphasize readiness. Strategic planning assumed the possibility of confrontation, particularly in Europe and East Asia. Kennedy listened carefully to these assessments, weighing them against diplomatic considerations. He resisted calls for aggressive posturing that might provoke escalation without clear benefit. One of the administration's earliest challenges involved Berlin, a city divided physically and symbolically. The status of Berlin remained unresolved, a reminder of unfinished post-war arrangements. Tensions flared periodically, testing resolve on both sides. Kennedy approached the issue with restraint, emphasizing commitment to West Berlin while avoiding actions that could trigger confrontation. Communication with Soviet leadership was cautious. Mutual suspicion limited openness. Messages were carefully worded, often indirect. Kennedy sought to signal firmness without hostility. He understood that misinterpretation could be dangerous. The absence of trust required clarity, not bravado. Within his administration, debate was encouraged. Advisors from military, diplomatic, and intelligence backgrounds offered differing perspectives. Kennedy valued this diversity of opinion. He believed that disagreement, managed constructively, reduced the risk of groupthink. Decisions were often delayed until multiple viewpoints had been considered. Publicly, Kennedy maintained a calm tone. He avoided language that framed the Cold War as a moral crusade. Instead, he spoke of responsibility, preparedness, and vigilance. This approach reflected an understanding that rhetoric could inflame tensions as easily as it could reassure. Foreign policy also intersected with domestic politics. Congressional approval was required for funding and initiatives. Public opinion influenced flexibility. Kennedy navigated these constraints carefully, seeking consensus where possible. He understood that sustained foreign engagement required domestic support. Intelligence assessments played an increasingly central role. Reports on Soviet capabilities, emerging movements, and regional conflicts informed planning. Kennedy approached intelligence cautiously, aware of its limitations. He asked for clarification and challenged assumptions, recognizing that incomplete or biased information could lead to flawed conclusions. The early months of his presidency were marked by learning rather than decisive action. Kennedy absorbed briefings, traveled to meet allies, and established channels of communication. He was aware that his youth and relative inexperience invited scrutiny. He responded not by asserting authority aggressively, but by demonstrating diligence and attention. As pressures mounted, the administration faced situations that demanded immediate response. Crises emerged in multiple regions, each with unique complexities. Kennedy resisted the urge to simplify. He treated each case individually, balancing principles with practical constraints. The Cold War required constant calibration. Deterrence depended on credibility, yet credibility did not require confrontation at every opportunity. Kennedy sought to preserve this balance, aware that missteps could have cascading effects. His approach to foreign policy was shaped by an understanding of history. He was mindful of how earlier leaders had stumbled through misjudgment or overconfidence. He believed that patience and adaptability were essential in a nuclear age. As 1961 progressed, the pressure of global responsibility intensified. Kennedy's administration had not yet faced its defining test, but the groundwork was being laid. Decisions made quietly, often unnoticed by the public, would shape the context for crises to come. Foreign policy under pressure revealed the complexity of leadership in a divided world. Kennedy did not seek to resolve the Cold War. He sought to manage it, reduce its risks, and navigate its uncertainties with care. The calm that characterized his public demeanor masked the weight of constant decision-making. Each choice carried implications beyond immediate outcomes. Kennedy accepted this burden without dramatization, understanding that leadership in his era required restraint as much as resolve. The Bay of Pigs failure, The first major crisis of John Fitzgerald Kennedy's presidency did not arrive gradually. It emerged from plans already in motion, shaped by decisions made before he entered office, and carried forward by institutional momentum that proved difficult to halt. The event that followed would become known as the Bay of Pigs invasion, and it would mark a sobering lesson in power, responsibility, and the limits of control. The origins of the plan lay in the final years of the Eisenhower administration. In Cuba, a revolutionary government led by Fidel Castro had taken power in 1959, overthrowing a regime long supported by the United States. Initially, American officials were uncertain how to respond. Over time, however, Castro's alignment with the Soviet Union hardened perceptions. Cuba came to be viewed not simply as a neighboring state pursuing independence, but as a strategic threat positioned close to American shores. Within US intelligence and defense circles, discussions turned toward removal of the Cuban government. The Central Intelligence Agency developed a plan to train Cuban exiles to launch an invasion that would spark a popular uprising. The objective was to replace Castro with a government more aligned with American interests without overt US military involvement. When Kennedy assumed the presidency, this plan was already advanced. Training camps were operational, resources had been allocated. Advisors presented the proposal as viable, emphasizing deniability and limited engagement. They argued that cancellation would undermine credibility and embolden adversaries. Kennedy approached the plan cautiously. He asked questions, requested revisions, and expressed concern about visibility and escalation. He was particularly wary of actions that might require direct military intervention if initial assumptions proved wrong. Yet he also faced pressure. Advisors stressed the risks of inaction and framed the invasion as a manageable operation. The decision-making environment was complex. Information was incomplete. Assumptions were optimistic. Dissenting views were present but not always emphasized. Kennedy, still early in his presidency, relied heavily on expert assessments. He approved a modified version of the plan, seeking to reduce the appearance of U.S. involvement while maintaining the operation's objectives. The invasion commenced in April 1961. Almost immediately, it became clear that critical assumptions were flawed. The anticipated popular uprising did not materialize. Cuban forces responded quickly and decisively. The invading force was isolated, undersupplied, and exposed. Kennedy faced an agonizing choice as events unfolded. He could escalate U.S. involvement to rescue the operation, risking open conflict and international condemnation, or he could refrain, accepting failure. He chose restraint. American air support was limited. Direct military intervention was withheld. Within days, the invasion collapsed. Many of the exiles were captured or killed. The operation's failure was unmistakable. International reaction was swift. The credibility of the United States was questioned. Castro's position within Cuba was strengthened, not weakened. Kennedy accepted responsibility publicly. He did not deflect blame onto predecessors or advisors. In statements to the press, he acknowledged the failure directly. This response contrasted with earlier political norms and reflected his belief that leadership required accountability. Privately, the experience was deeply unsettling. Kennedy reviewed the decision-making process carefully. He recognized how institutional momentum, group dynamics, and incomplete information had shaped outcomes. The failure revealed vulnerabilities within his administration and within his own approach. One of the most significant lessons involved the role of advisors. Kennedy realized that deference to expertise could obscure dissent. He began to emphasize the importance of structured debate, encouraging advisors to challenge assumptions openly. This shift would have lasting influence on his leadership style. The Bay of Pigs also altered Kennedy's relationship with the CIA. Trust was damaged. Kennedy questioned intelligence assessments more aggressively, seeking corroboration and clarity. He recognized that intelligence agencies, like any institution, were shaped by internal incentives and perspectives. Internationally, the failure had mixed consequences. While it damaged American prestige in the short term, Kennedy's restraint was noted by allies. His refusal to escalate demonstrated a willingness to prioritize stability over pride. This nuance was not lost on observers abroad. Domestically, criticism was intense. Political opponents seized on the failure as evidence of inexperience. Editorials questioned judgment. Supporters urged patience. Kennedy absorbed the criticism without public defensiveness. He continued to work, maintaining composure under scrutiny. The Bay of Pigs marked the end of any illusion that the presidency could be eased into gradually. Kennedy confronted the reality that decisions carried immediate and irreversible consequences. The margin for error was narrow. Preparation and skepticism became essential. The episode also hardened relations between the United States and Cuba. Castro moved decisively to align more closely with the Soviet Union, seeking protection against future attempts at overthrow. This alignment would have profound implications in the months ahead. For Kennedy, the failure became a reference point. It shaped how he approached subsequent crises, particularly those involving military advice and covert action. He became more cautious, more demanding of evidence, and more attentive to unintended consequences. The calm tone that characterized his public demeanor remained, but beneath it was a sharpened awareness of risk. The Bay of Pigs did not define his presidency, but it transformed it. It forced rapid maturation, accelerating lessons that might otherwise have been learned slowly. Leadership in the Cold War era allowed little room for trial and error. Kennedy learned this early, at considerable cost. The experience reinforced his belief that restraint could be a form of strength, and that accountability was not optional. As the administration regrouped, attention turned to repairing credibility and reassessing strategy. The lessons of the Bay of Pigs would soon be tested again, under even more dangerous circumstances. Leadership during nuclear crisis. The failure at the Bay of Pigs left an imprint on John Fitzgerald Kennedy's presidency that went beyond embarrassment or political cost. It reshaped how he approached power, advice, and risk. That recalibration would soon be tested under circumstances far more dangerous when the Cold War moved from abstraction to immediate threat. The episode that followed would come to be known as the Cuban Missile Crisis, though at the time it unfolded as a series of tense, uncertain days during which the possibility of nuclear war could not be dismissed. By 1962, the strategic environment had grown more volatile. The relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union was marked by mutual suspicion and rapid technological change. Both sides possessed nuclear weapons capable of unprecedented destruction. Military planners spoke in terms of deterrence and balance, yet these concepts rested on fragile assumptions about rational behavior and communication. Cuba remained central to this instability. After the Bay of Pigs, Fidel Castro's government moved closer to Moscow, seeking security against future intervention. Soviet leadership, under Nikita Khrushchev, viewed Cuba as both an ally and a strategic opportunity. The placement of Soviet missiles on the island promised to alter the balance of power by bringing American cities within immediate range. Kennedy was not initially aware of these developments. Intelligence gathering was imperfect, and information arrived in fragments. In October 1962, reconnaissance flights provided photographic evidence that Soviet missile installations were under construction in Cuba. The implications were immediate and severe. This was not a symbolic gesture or a diplomatic dispute. It was a direct challenge to American security. Kennedy convened a small group of advisors, later known as the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or EXCOM. This group included military leaders, diplomats, intelligence officials, and senior members of the administration. Kennedy's intention was to create an environment where options could be debated openly, without premature commitment. The discussions were intense but controlled. Military advisors proposed airstrikes and invasion as decisive solutions. These options promised clarity, but carried enormous risks. An attack on Cuba could provoke retaliation elsewhere, particularly in Europe. The potential for escalation was real and difficult to predict. Diplomatic options were also considered. Some advisors argued for negotiation or public appeal to international bodies. These approaches offered the possibility of de-escalation but risked appearing weak or allowing the missile installations to become operational. Kennedy listened carefully. He recalled the lessons of the Bay of Pigs, where assumptions had gone unchallenged and momentum had carried decisions forward. This time, he insisted on rigorous examination of consequences. He asked advisors to articulate not only best-case outcomes, but worst-case scenarios. The deliberations revealed how little certainty existed. Intelligence could not confirm whether the missiles were already operational. Communication with Soviet leadership was indirect and slow. Public awareness was limited. But once the crisis became visible, pressure would mount rapidly. Kennedy faced the challenge of time. Delay allowed missile installations to progress. Action risked irreversible escalation. He sought an option that preserved control while signalling resolve. The solution that emerged was a naval quarantine, later termed a blockade, around Cuba. This measure aimed to prevent further delivery of offensive weapons without initiating immediate combat. The decision was not without risk. A blockade could be interpreted as an act of war. Soviet ships approaching the quarantine line might refuse to stop, forcing confrontation. Yet Kennedy judged that this approach preserved flexibility and reduced the likelihood of immediate violence. Public announcement of the crisis followed. Kennedy addressed the nation calmly, explaining the discovery of missiles and the steps being taken. His tone was measured, avoiding alarmist language. He emphasized the seriousness of the situation while reassuring Americans that careful action was underway. The address had a dual audience. It spoke to the American public, seeking confidence and understanding. It also communicated to Soviet leadership, signaling that the United States was prepared to act but remained open to resolution. As the quarantine took effect, tension intensified. Soviet ships moved toward the line. Military forces were placed on high alert. Communications between Washington and Moscow became urgent. Each side attempted to interpret the other's intentions through limited signals. Within the White House, debate continued. Kennedy encouraged dissenting views, recognizing that consensus could obscure danger. Advisors revisited assumptions repeatedly. The atmosphere was serious but not panicked. Procedures were followed. Information was reviewed continuously. The role of chance loomed large. Technical malfunctions, miscommunication, or unauthorized action could trigger escalation. Kennedy was acutely aware of this vulnerability. He worked to maintain centralized control over military responses, reducing the risk of unintended confrontation. Messages from Khrushchev arrived, sometimes inconsistent in tone and content. One communication suggested a willingness to withdraw missiles in exchange for assurances regarding Cuba's security. Another took a more confrontational stance. Kennedy and his advisors analyzed these messages carefully, seeking a path that could satisfy essential interests without public humiliation on either side. A critical element of the resolution involved a private understanding. The United States agreed to remove obsolete missiles from Turkey, a concession not publicly linked to the crisis at the time. This arrangement allowed Khrushchev to claim a measure of success while meeting Kennedy's core objective, removal of missiles from Cuba. After days of uncertainty, Soviet ships turned back, construction on missile sites halted, an agreement was reached. The immediate danger passed. Nuclear war was avoided. Kennedy's handling of the crisis was widely regarded as effective. He had resisted pressure for immediate military action, maintained open channels of communication, and accepted compromise where necessary. His leadership emphasized restraint without surrender. The aftermath brought reflection. Kennedy recognized how close the world had come to catastrophe. The crisis reinforced his belief that nuclear weapons demanded new forms of diplomacy and communication. It was not enough to rely on deterrence alone. Mechanisms for dialogue and crisis management were essential. In the months that followed, steps were taken to reduce risk. A direct communication line between Washington and Moscow, later known as the Hotline, was established. Efforts toward arms control gained momentum. Kennedy supported measures aimed at limiting nuclear testing and improving transparency. The Cuban Missile Crisis also shaped Kennedy's view of military advice. He remained respectful of expertise but more insistent on questioning assumptions. He valued perspectives that acknowledged uncertainty rather than promised certainty. Public perception of Kennedy shifted. He was seen as composed under pressure, capable of navigating extreme danger without escalation. This reputation strengthened his authority domestically and internationally. It also carried weight within his administration, reinforcing his leadership style. Yet Kennedy did not interpret the outcome as a victory in conventional terms. He avoided triumphalism. He understood that the resolution depended on compromise and that future crises were likely. The Cold War remained unresolved, its underlying tensions intact. The crisis underscored the limits of power. Even the most capable leaders operated within constraints shaped by technology, institutions, and human fallibility. Kennedy accepted this reality. He viewed leadership not as control over events, but as stewardship through uncertainty. For Kennedy personally, the experience reaffirmed the importance of calm deliberation. The habits formed through illness, war, and early political life had proven relevant at the highest level. Managing fear, resisting impulse, and sustaining focus were not abstract virtues. They were practical necessities. The Cuban Missile Crisis did not end the Cold War, but it altered its trajectory. It demonstrated that communication and restraint could prevent disaster. It also revealed how fragile peace could be in a nuclear age. As Kennedy moved forward, these lessons would influence his approach to foreign policy and global responsibility. The crisis had demanded everything he had learned. It had tested judgment, patience, and resolve. In navigating those days, Kennedy had confronted the ultimate stakes of leadership. He emerged with a deeper awareness of risk and a renewed commitment to caution. The calm tone he maintained was not a performance. It was a reflection of discipline under pressure. The world continued, chastened but intact. And for a moment, the path of history bent away from catastrophe, guided by choices made deliberately under extraordinary strain, civil rights and moral limits. While foreign crises demanded immediate attention, the pressures shaping John Fitzgerald Kennedy's presidency were not confined to distant borders. At home, a long-standing struggle over civil rights intensified, pressing moral questions into the center of American political life. Kennedy did not enter the presidency as a crusader on this issue, nor did he approach it with indifference. Instead, he confronted civil rights as a problem bound tightly to law, power, timing, and the limits of presidential authority. The civil rights movement was not new when Kennedy took office. For decades, African Americans had organized, petitioned, litigated, and protested against segregation and discrimination. Court decisions, particularly Brown versus Board of Education, had challenged the legal foundation of segregation, yet implementation was slow and often resisted. Violence, intimidation, and legal obstruction remained common in many states. Kennedy understood the moral clarity of the issue. He did not question the injustice of segregation or the necessity of change. What complicated his response was the structure of American politics. Congress remained divided. Southern Democrats held powerful committee positions. Any aggressive legislative push risked paralysis across his broader agenda. Kennedy weighed these realities carefully, aware that moral certainty did not guarantee political success. In his early months, Kennedy focused on enforcing existing laws rather than proposing sweeping new legislation. His administration supported court orders requiring desegregation and used federal authority to ensure compliance where possible. These actions were framed as respect for the rule of law rather than ideological intervention. Kennedy believed that grounding action in legality would reduce backlash and sustain progress. Events soon tested this approach. Freedom riders, challenging segregation in interstate travel, faced violent resistance. Images of buses attacked and protesters beaten circulated widely. Public opinion began to shift as the reality of Southern resistance became impossible to ignore. Kennedy responded by deploying federal marshals to protect activists, emphasizing order and safety while avoiding inflammatory language. This balancing act drew criticism from multiple sides. Civil rights leaders urged stronger action, arguing that gradualism prolonged injustice. Segregationists accused Kennedy of federal overreach. Kennedy absorbed both critiques, recognizing that leadership often involved choosing between dissatisfaction and paralysis. The role of figures such as Martin Luther King Jr. became increasingly prominent. King's philosophy of nonviolent protest and moral appeal contrasted with the entrenched resistance of segregationist authorities. Kennedy's interactions with King were cautious but respectful. He recognized King's influence and legitimacy, even as he navigated political constraints. As civil rights demonstrations spread, so did tensions. In universities, public spaces, and workplaces, the struggle over equality became visible. Kennedy faced the challenge of responding decisively without provoking widespread unrest. His administration relied on negotiation, federal authority, and public messaging aimed at de-escalation. One of the most significant confrontations occurred during the integration of the University of Mississippi. When resistance escalated into violence, Kennedy authorized the use of federal troops to restore order and enforce the law. The decision was deliberate and restrained, framed as necessary to uphold constitutional authority rather than to punish opposition. These episodes gradually altered Kennedy's understanding of the limits of incrementalism. Enforcement alone could not resolve deeply rooted injustice. Legal victories without legislative support left gaps that resistance could exploit. Kennedy began to consider more comprehensive action, though he remained aware of political obstacles. Public opinion continued to evolve. Televised coverage brought the realities of segregation into living rooms across the country. Images of peaceful protesters facing hostility challenged complacency. Kennedy recognized the power of visibility. He understood that moral awareness, once awakened, could not easily be contained. In June 1963, Kennedy addressed the nation on civil rights in a speech that marked a turning point. He framed the issue not merely as a legal matter, but as a moral one affecting the nation's identity. He spoke of equal treatment as a principle rooted in American values, avoiding rhetorical excess while acknowledging urgency. Following this address, Kennedy proposed comprehensive civil rights legislation. The proposal aimed to address segregation in public accommodations, employment discrimination, and voting rights. The decision represented a shift from cautious enforcement to legislative commitment. Kennedy was aware that passage would be difficult and that opposition would be fierce. The legislative process moved slowly. Hearings, debates, and amendments consumed time. Southern opposition was entrenched. Kennedy worked to build coalitions, appealing to moderate Republicans and Northern Democrats. He framed the bill as necessary for national unity and global credibility, arguing that domestic injustice undermined American leadership abroad. Throughout this period, Kennedy's approach remained measured. He did not resort to dramatic gestures or confrontational rhetoric. He relied on persuasion, procedure, and persistence. Critics continued to argue that his actions were insufficiently bold. Supporters noted the constraints he faced. The civil rights struggle also intersected with broader social change. Economic disparities, educational access, and urban conditions complicated the landscape. Kennedy recognized that legal equality alone could not resolve these challenges. His administration explored programs aimed at addressing poverty and opportunity, though many would remain incomplete during his tenure. Privately, Kennedy reflected on the moral dimensions of leadership. The issue forced him to confront the tension between political pragmatism and ethical responsibility. He understood that delay carried its own costs, measured not only in policy outcomes but in human experience. As 1963 progressed, momentum built. Civil rights leaders organized a massive march on Washington, bringing attention and urgency to the cause. Kennedy viewed the demonstration with cautious support, recognizing its potential to influence public opinion while concerned about the risk of disorder. The event proceeded peacefully, reinforcing calls for action. Kennedy's commitment to civil rights did not resolve all questions. His proposals faced continued resistance. Progress was uneven. Yet the direction was clear. The presidency had moved from cautious engagement to active advocacy within the limits of political reality. The struggle illuminated the boundaries of presidential power. Kennedy could propose, persuade, and enforce, but he could not dictate outcomes unilaterally. He navigated these limits without surrendering principle, accepting that leadership involved working within imperfect systems. The civil rights movement also revealed the interconnectedness of domestic and international concerns. Kennedy understood that America's moral authority abroad depended on justice at home. The Cold War magnified this connection, as global audiences scrutinized American claims of freedom and equality. As the year continued, Kennedy remained engaged, attentive to developments and prepared to adjust strategy. He did not claim credit prematurely. He understood that meaningful change often unfolded slowly, through sustained effort rather than singular moments. Civil rights tested Kennedy's presidency in ways that differed from foreign crises. There were no clear deadlines, no decisive resolutions. Instead, there was ongoing pressure, requiring patience and resolve. Kennedy's response reflected his broader leadership style, cautious but committed, restrained but purposeful. The moral limits he confronted were not barriers to action, but reminders of responsibility. He learned that progress required not only intention, but persistence within constraint. The choices he made did not end the struggle, but they altered its trajectory. As events continued to unfold, Kennedy's engagement with civil rights would shape how his presidency was remembered. The issue demanded clarity without excess, courage without spectacle. In facing it, Kennedy accepted that leadership often meant advancing justice step by step, even when the path was uneven and the outcome uncertain. Space, science, and American identity. By the early 1960s, the contest between nations was no longer confined to borders, alliances, or even oceans. It had extended upward, beyond the atmosphere, into a realm that was at once technical, symbolic, and deeply psychological. For John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the space race was not simply about rockets and satellites. It became a way to think about national purpose, confidence, and the kind of future the United States intended to claim. The origins of this competition predated Kennedy's presidency. In 1957, the launch of Sputnik by the Soviet Union had unsettled American confidence. The satellite itself posed no immediate military threat, but its implications were unmistakable. If the Soviet Union could place an object into orbit, it could also potentially deliver weapons across continents. More subtly, Sputnik challenged assumptions about technological leadership and educational strength. By the time Kennedy took office, this anxiety had not faded. It had intensified. Subsequent Soviet achievements, including the first human spaceflight, reinforced the perception that the United States was reacting rather than leading. For a nation that associated progress with innovation, this was deeply unsettling. Kennedy inherited a space program that existed, but lacked coherence and urgency. The NASA had been established, yet its mission was still evolving. Projects advanced incrementally, constrained by budgets, competing priorities, and uncertainty about long-term goals. Kennedy recognized that without clear direction, effort would remain fragmented. At the same time, he was cautious. The space race involved enormous expense and risk. Rockets failed. Astronauts faced danger. There were no guarantees of success. Kennedy understood that committing to an ambitious space program meant accepting uncertainty and potential embarrassment. He did not rush to announce grand plans without consideration. His approach was shaped by broader concerns about national morale and global perception. The Cold War was as much about confidence as capability. Demonstrations of technological mastery signaled competence, organization, and resolve. Kennedy saw space as an arena where these qualities could be displayed without direct military confrontation. In 1961, after careful consultation with advisors, scientists, and legislators, Kennedy addressed Congress with a proposal that would define his presidency's relationship to science and exploration. He called for the United States to commit to landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth before the end of the decade. The goal was specific, measurable, and ambitious. The decision was not framed as a romantic adventure. Kennedy presented it as a practical challenge that would mobilize national resources, stimulate innovation, and restore confidence. He acknowledged the cost and difficulty openly. There was no suggestion that success would be easy or inevitable. This clarity mattered. By defining a concrete objective, Kennedy transformed space exploration from an abstract aspiration into a coordinated national project. Agencies, universities, and private industries aligned around a shared purpose. Timelines were established, funding increased, research accelerated. Kennedy's rhetoric around space avoided exaggeration. He did not speak of destiny or cosmic symbolism. Instead, he emphasized effort, organization, and discipline. Space, in his framing, was a test of whether a democratic society could marshal resources effectively without coercion. The moon goal also served a strategic function. It shifted competition into an area where the United States believed it could excel through industrial capacity, scientific collaboration, and sustained investment. It reduced the emphasis on single dramatic firsts and focused instead on a complex, long-term achievement. Public reaction was mixed initially. Some questioned the expense, particularly amid domestic needs. Others worried about risk. Yet the clarity of the goal and Kennedy's calm articulation gradually built support. The space program came to be seen as an investment in education, technology, and national confidence. Within the administration, Kennedy monitored progress closely but did not micromanage technical decisions. He relied on experts to address engineering challenges while maintaining oversight of broader objectives. This balance reflected his leadership style, attentive without intrusion, strategic without spectacle. The space program influenced education policy as well. Concerns about scientific literacy led to increased emphasis on mathematics and science in schools. Scholarships, research funding, and institutional support expanded. Kennedy understood that space exploration was not an isolated endeavour. It required a broad base of knowledge and skill. Internationally, the moon commitment sent a clear signal. It demonstrated resolve and long-term thinking. Allies viewed it as evidence of American capability. Rivals recognized the scale of the undertaking. The competition remained intense, but it was channeled into a domain where catastrophic escalation was unlikely. Kennedy also explored the possibility of cooperation. Despite rivalry, he recognized that shared scientific goals could reduce tension. He spoke cautiously about joint ventures, particularly in areas such as satellite communication and research. These ideas did not immediately alter the competitive framework, but they introduced the notion that space need not be exclusively a battleground. The cultural impact of the space program was significant. Images of rockets, astronauts, and control rooms entered public consciousness. Space became a symbol of modernity and aspiration. For younger generations, it offered a vision of progress grounded in knowledge and collaboration. Kennedy's engagement with science extended beyond space. He supported research in medicine, technology, and energy, viewing scientific advancement as essential to national well-being. His administration emphasized evidence-based policy, valuing expertise while remaining aware of its limits. Health challenges did not diminish his interest in these areas. On the contrary, his own experiences with illness reinforced his appreciation for medical research and innovation. He understood how scientific progress translated into human impact. As the space program advanced, setbacks occurred. Test failures reminded the nation of risk. Kennedy responded without alarm, reiterating the importance of perseverance. He understood that progress rarely followed a straight line. By 1963, the moon mission had become a defining element of American identity. It represented ambition without aggression, competition without immediate violence. Kennedy saw it as a way to channel national energy constructively, yet he remained realistic. Space exploration did not solve domestic injustice or international rivalry. It was one component of a broader strategy aimed at confidence and capability. Kennedy avoided presenting it as a cure-all. The relationship between science and policy remained central. Kennedy encouraged dialogue between researchers and decision-makers, recognizing that innovation required mutual understanding. He resisted the temptation to politicize scientific findings, valuing credibility over convenience. As his presidency progressed, the space program continued to gather momentum. Contractors expanded facilities, engineers refined designs, astronauts trained rigorously. The timeline was demanding, but progress was visible. Kennedy took pride in these developments without claiming personal credit. He understood that the effort belonged to thousands of individuals working collaboratively. His role was to set direction and sustain commitment. The moon goal also reflected Kennedy's understanding of leadership in a modern age. It demonstrated that national projects could be framed around challenge and effort rather than fear. It suggested that competition need not be destructive. Science and space thus became intertwined with American identity during his presidency. They represented confidence grounded in capability, ambition tempered by realism. Kennedy's approach avoided spectacle, focusing instead on organization and resolve. As the decade moved forward, the space program stood as a testament to what coordinated effort could achieve. It did not eliminate uncertainty, but it offered direction. For Kennedy, this was its greatest value. The contest for the future would continue in many arenas. Space provided one path forward, defined not by domination, but by disciplined striving. In committing to it, Kennedy shaped how the nation understood progress and purpose during a period of profound uncertainty. Private strains behind public calm. From the outside, John Fitzgerald Kennedy appeared to move through the presidency with composure and control. His public schedule was full, his press appearances steady, and his demeanor consistently measured. Yet behind this outward calm lay a private reality shaped by persistent physical strain, constrained privacy, and the cumulative weight of responsibility. These pressures did not interrupt his presidency dramatically, but they influenced it quietly day after day. Kennedy's health had never been simple, and the presidency intensified existing challenges. Chronic back pain remained a constant presence, often severe enough to interfere with sleep and mobility. Past injuries and surgeries had provided limited relief. New treatments were attempted, sometimes improving symptoms temporarily, sometimes introducing new complications. Pain management required careful attention and discretion. The demands of the office left little room for rest. Long days, frequent travel, and the necessity of constant alertness exacerbated physical discomfort. Kennedy adapted through routine and discipline. He structured his day carefully, balancing periods of activity with brief intervals of rest. This management was deliberate and often invisible to observers. Medical care was provided quietly, within the confines of the White House or at secure locations. Details were closely guarded. Kennedy understood that public knowledge of vulnerability could become a political liability. He maintained privacy not to deceive, but to preserve authority and stability in an era where leadership was closely associated with strength. Alongside physical strain, the presidency imposed psychological pressure. The weight of decision-making was unrelenting. Crises, once resolved, were replaced by new ones. There was no period of true respite. Even moments of apparent calm were provisional, shaped by anticipation of what might follow. Kennedy coped through focus and routine. He read extensively, finding in history a sense of perspective. Past leaders had faced challenges that seemed overwhelming in their time, yet history had moved forward. This awareness did not minimize present risks, but it provided context. His personal relationships were affected by the constraints of office. Marriage, family life, and friendship existed within limited windows of time and privacy. Jacqueline Kennedy managed the public aspects of their partnership with grace and reserve, cultivating an image of cultural refinement that complemented Kennedy's political role. Privately, the demands of the presidency limited opportunities for shared normalcy. The White House itself was a paradoxical environment. It was both a home and a workplace, a symbol and a fortress. Privacy was limited. Security protocols governed movement and interaction. Kennedy adjusted to this environment by maintaining emotional distance. He valued connection, but understood that attachment carried risks in a position defined by scrutiny. Kennedy's temperament favored restraint. He did not externalize stress or frustration. Instead, he compartmentalized. This ability, developed early through illness and observation, allowed him to function under pressure. It also imposed costs. Emotional strain was absorbed internally, rarely released. Despite these constraints, Kennedy retained curiosity and humor. He engaged with advisors, artists, and intellectuals, finding stimulation in ideas and conversation. These interactions provided relief from the narrow focus of crisis management. They also reinforced his belief that leadership required engagement beyond policy alone. Health concerns occasionally intruded visibly. Periods of absence prompted speculation. Kennedy responded not with explanation but with continued performance. He returned to public view promptly, projecting steadiness. This pattern reinforced his reputation for resilience, though it masked ongoing difficulty. The management of pain and fatigue required discipline. Medication schedules were precise. Physical therapy was integrated into daily routine. These efforts were not framed as exceptional. They were treated as part of the work of governing, no different from briefings or meetings. The presidency also imposed limits on spontaneity. Schedules were fixed. Security considerations dictated movement. Kennedy adapted by finding flexibility within structure. He valued moments of informal discussion, brief walks, and quiet reading. These small freedoms mattered. As the administration progressed, the accumulation of strain became more evident privately. Advisors noticed moments of fatigue, though rarely indecision. Kennedy relied increasingly on delegation, trusting experienced staff to manage details. This trust reflected maturity rather than withdrawal. The contrast between public calm and private strain shaped Kennedy's leadership style. He favored preparation over improvisation, deliberation over impulse. This approach reduced unnecessary stress and allowed for controlled response. It also reinforced his image as composed and thoughtful. The broader context amplified these pressures. The Cold War remained unresolved. Civil rights debates intensified. Domestic and international expectations grew. Kennedy understood that the presidency did not offer closure, only continuation. Despite challenges, he maintained perspective. He recognized that personal comfort was secondary to responsibility. This acceptance did not eliminate discomfort, but it framed it. Leadership, in his view, involved endurance as much as vision. As 1963 progressed, Kennedy remained engaged, attentive to developments at home and abroad. He continued to travel, speak, and negotiate. Public appearances were measured, reflecting energy without excess. The discipline that sustained him was not visible, but it was constant. Private strain did not undermine public calm. It shaped it. Kennedy's composure was not an absence of difficulty, but a response to it. His leadership was defined not by ease, but by management of constraint. In this balance between visibility and privacy, Kennedy navigated the presidency with restraint. The costs were real, but they were borne quietly. The calm projected outward was the product of sustained effort inward. As events moved forward, the cumulative impact of these pressures would continue to shape his decisions. The presidency demanded endurance. Kennedy provided it without spectacle, guided by habit and discipline developed over a lifetime. The private strains behind the public calm were not separate from leadership. They were part of it, influencing how decisions were made, how risks were assessed, and how authority was exercised. Kennedy understood this connection. He accepted it. The presidency did not offer relief from vulnerability. It required coexistence with it. In managing that coexistence, Kennedy demonstrated a form of strength that was rarely acknowledged but deeply consequential. A changing world, a short future. By 1963, the world around John Fitzgerald Kennedy was changing in ways that were neither sudden nor easily contained. The Cold War had entered a more complex phase. Decolonization continued to reshape global alignments. At home, social expectations pressed harder against long-standing structures. Kennedy sensed that the pace of change was accelerating, and that leadership required not only reaction, but anticipation. Internationally, the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis lingered. Though immediate danger had receded, underlying tensions remained unresolved. Relations with the Soviet Union were cautious, marked by limited progress and persistent mistrust. Kennedy pursued incremental steps to reduce risk, supporting initiatives aimed at arms control and communication. These efforts did not promise resolution, but they offered stability. One such effort was the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which sought to limit atmospheric nuclear testing. Kennedy supported the treaty as a practical measure to reduce environmental harm and signal restraint. Negotiations were careful and technical, reflecting mutual suspicion and shared concern. When the treaty was signed and ratified, it represented a modest but meaningful step toward managing nuclear competition. Kennedy's approach to foreign policy during this period emphasized engagement without illusion. He recognized that ideological rivalry would persist, but he believed that mechanisms for dialogue could reduce the likelihood of catastrophe. His speeches avoided triumphalism. He framed progress as tentative and conditional, requiring continued effort. At the same time, conflicts in the developing world demanded attention. In Southeast Asia, instability in Vietnam raised difficult questions. The legacy of colonialism, internal divisions, and Cold War rivalry converged in a region far from American shores. Kennedy inherited commitments and advisors who viewed the situation through the lens of containment. Kennedy approached Vietnam with caution. He authorized limited increases in advisory support while resisting pressure for large-scale military deployment. He questioned assumptions about the effectiveness of force in a complex political environment. His stance reflected skepticism shaped by history and experience. He understood that local conditions mattered, and that external intervention carried risks of escalation. This caution did not resolve the issue. Debates within the administration continued. Military advisors emphasized credibility and deterrence. Others argued for political solutions. Kennedy listened, weighing options without reaching definitive conclusions. He recognized that choices made in Vietnam could shape American involvement for years. In Europe, the status of Berlin remained a sensitive issue. The city stood as a symbol of division, and the construction of the Berlin Wall underscored the permanence of separation. Kennedy reaffirmed American commitment to West Berlin while avoiding actions that could provoke confrontation. His visit to the city later in 1963 was intended as reassurance rather than challenge. Relations with Latin America continued to occupy attention. The Alliance for Progress sought to encourage reform and development, addressing inequality and instability. Results were mixed. Structural challenges proved resistant to rapid change. Kennedy acknowledged these limitations, adjusting expectations while maintaining engagement. Africa and Asia presented similar complexities. Newly independent nations sought support without domination. Kennedy encouraged diplomacy that respected sovereignty while advancing shared interests. This approach required patience and flexibility, qualities he valued. Domestically, pressures intensified. The civil rights movement gained momentum, pushing the issue from moral debate toward legislative action. Kennedy's proposed civil rights bill faced strong opposition in Congress. The legislative process was slow and contentious. Kennedy worked to build alliances, appealing to fairness and national unity. Public demonstrations increased visibility and urgency. The March on Washington in August 1963 brought civil rights into sharper focus. Kennedy viewed the event as a turning point in public awareness. He continued to support legislative efforts, recognizing that passage would require sustained commitment beyond rhetoric. Economic policy also demanded attention. While growth continued, disparities persisted. Kennedy proposed tax reforms aimed at stimulating investment and consumption. These proposals reflected his belief in pragmatic economic management rather than ideological rigidity. Negotiations with Congress continued, with outcomes uncertain. Cultural change accompanied political debate. Younger generations questioned established norms. Art, literature, and music reflected experimentation and critique. Kennedy welcomed engagement with culture, viewing it as a sign of vitality rather than disorder. The White House became a venue for intellectual exchange, reinforcing an image of openness. Kennedy's public communication evolved alongside these changes. He spoke more frequently about shared responsibility and the challenges of modern governance. His tone remained measured, avoiding exaggeration. He acknowledged difficulty without projecting pessimism. This balance reinforced public confidence. Privately, Kennedy remained aware of the limits of time. Health concerns persisted, managed but unresolved. The pace of the presidency left little room for recovery. Yet he continued to plan beyond the immediate horizon. He considered the possibility of re-election, policy priorities, and long-term goals. Among these goals was continued progress toward arms control and reduced nuclear risk. Kennedy believed that the nuclear age demanded new forms of leadership and cooperation. He supported dialogue even when progress was incremental. His thinking reflected a long view shaped by history. The sense of a changing world also influenced Kennedy's perspective on legacy. He did not dwell on personal remembrance. He focused on institutional strength and policy direction. He understood that outcomes often extended beyond individual tenure. As 1963 progressed, the presidency felt both established and provisional. Achievements had been made, but challenges remained unresolved. The future appeared open, shaped by decisions yet to be made. Kennedy's leadership during this period was characterized by restraint and adaptability. He resisted the urge to claim closure where none existed. He accepted that progress often unfolded unevenly. The world around him continued to shift. Alliances evolved. Social movements gained strength. Technological change accelerated. Kennedy navigated these dynamics with attention and care, aware that leadership involved constant adjustment. The notion of a short future was not explicit, but it was implicit in the intensity of the moment. Decisions carried weight beyond their immediate context. Kennedy approached them with seriousness, informed by experience and reflection. As he prepared for travel and public engagement later in the year, Kennedy remained focused on continuity and stability. He did not seek dramatic gestures. He sought steady movement forward. The changing world demanded leadership that balanced caution with commitment. Kennedy's presidency reflected this balance. He engaged with complexity rather than retreating from it. The future remained uncertain, shaped by forces beyond any single leader's control. Kennedy understood this. He viewed leadership not as mastery over events, but as navigation through them. In this final phase before tragedy, Kennedy's presidency stood at a point of possibility. The path ahead was not fixed. It was defined by choices, pressures, and chance. The world continued to change. Kennedy continued to lead, attentive to the moment and mindful of the future, even as time pressed forward. Dallas, and the end of a presidency. By November 1963, John Fitzgerald Kennedy's presidency had entered a phase of consolidation rather than transformation. The frenetic uncertainty of the early years had settled into a steadier rhythm. Major crises had been confronted. Long-term challenges remained unresolved but actively engaged. Kennedy was looking ahead to legislative battles, to foreign policy recalibration, and to the approaching election year. aware that continuity now mattered as much as initiative. The decision to travel to Texas in late November was shaped by practical political considerations rather than symbolism. Texas was a large, diverse state with internal divisions within the Democratic Party. Kennedy's advisers viewed the trip as an opportunity to reinforce unity ahead of the 1964 campaign. It was not intended as a dramatic statement or a risky venture. It was routine, calculated, and in line with the rhythms of presidential politics. The atmosphere in the country at that time was complex. Optimism coexisted with tension. The Cold War remained unresolved. Civil rights debates intensified emotions across regions. Political rhetoric had sharpened in some quarters, particularly among groups hostile to federal authority or social change. Kennedy was aware of these undercurrents, but he did not view them as reason for withdrawal from public engagement. On the 22nd of November 1963, Kennedy arrived in Dallas, Texas. The visit was structured as a sequence of public appearances designed to project accessibility and confidence. Motorcades were a standard feature of such visits, offering visibility and connection. Security procedures reflected prevailing norms, which emphasized openness over isolation. Kennedy believed strongly in being seen and approached, a belief rooted in his understanding of democratic leadership. As the motorcade moved through the city, crowds gathered along the route. The reception appeared warm. There was no immediate indication of danger. Kennedy sat upright, attentive, acknowledging onlookers. The scene was unremarkable in its normality. It reflected the public presidency he had cultivated, present, composed, and engaged. The events that followed unfolded rapidly and without clarity. Gunfire shattered the routine progression of the motorcade. Confusion followed immediately. In those moments, the carefully managed rhythms of the presidency collapsed into uncertainty and alarm. Kennedy was gravely wounded. Emergency procedures were initiated. The motorcade diverted to a nearby hospital. Medical staff responded with urgency, but the injuries were catastrophic. Despite efforts to save him, Kennedy was pronounced dead later that day. He was 46 years old. The announcement reverberated across the nation and the world. News spread quickly, interrupting regular broadcasts and daily routines. For many Americans, the moment was defined by disbelief. Kennedy had been a constant presence, his voice and image familiar through television and radio. The suddenness of his death defied comprehension. Public reaction was immediate and profound. Crowds gathered spontaneously. Churches opened their doors. Flags were lowered. The tone was not hysterical but stunned. There was a sense that something stable had been broken, not through gradual change but through abrupt violence. The transition of power occurred swiftly. Guided by constitutional procedure, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson was sworn in as president the same day. The formality of the process underscored institutional continuity, even as emotional shock rippled through the country. Kennedy himself had often emphasized the importance of orderly governance. In this moment, that emphasis proved essential. Investigations began almost immediately. Questions emerged about responsibility, motive, and circumstance. Official inquiries sought clarity amid confusion. Public debate intensified. Speculation proliferated. Yet in the immediate aftermath, attention focused less on explanation than on loss. Kennedy's body was returned to Washington. Funeral arrangements were made with care and restraint. The ceremonies reflected both national mourning and personal grief. Leaders from around the world attended, underscoring Kennedy's global stature. The procession through the Capitol was watched by millions, silent and attentive. The imagery of those days became etched into collective memory. It was not defined by grand symbolism deliberately constructed, but by simple gestures, quiet processions, lowered flags, measured words. The restraint mirrored Kennedy's own public demeanor. In assessing the end of his presidency, it is important to avoid retrospective simplification. Kennedy's time in office had not resolved the Cold War. Civil rights legislation remained incomplete. Economic reforms were still contested. His presidency was a work in progress, not a finished chapter. Yet his death transformed perception. The future he might have shaped became a matter of speculation. Unfinished initiatives took on heightened significance. Decisions not yet made acquired imagined weight. This transformation was not planned or controlled. It was a consequence of abrupt absence. International reaction reflected both shock and reassessment. Allies mourned the loss of a leader perceived as thoughtful and stabilizing. Rivals adjusted calculations, uncertain how policy continuity would be maintained. The world did not pause, but it recalibrated. Within the United States, the impact extended beyond policy. Kennedy had come to represent a certain tone, measured, composed, attentive to complexity. His assassination disrupted that tone, injecting a sense of vulnerability into public life. Confidence in stability was shaken, even as institutions functioned as designed. The end of Kennedy's presidency was not marked by resolution, but by interruption. It forced a reckoning with the unpredictability of history. Plans, strategies, and trajectories were rendered incomplete. Leadership passed abruptly, without transition or preparation. Kennedy himself had understood the fragility of leadership. His experiences with illness, war, and crisis had taught him that control was always limited. Yet the manner of his death made that lesson unavoidable on a national scale. In the days that followed, commentary sought meaning. Some focused on policy legacy, others emphasized generational symbolism. Many simply expressed grief. Kennedy's presidency became framed not only by what had occurred, but by what would never occur. This framing was not immediate. It developed over time, shaped by memory and narrative. In the immediate aftermath, there was only loss and adjustment. The work of governing continued under new leadership, but the sense of rupture remained. The end of Kennedy's presidency was definitive, yet its significance was unresolved. It closed one chapter abruptly and opened another under circumstances no one had chosen. What remained was a record shaped by restraint, crisis management, and cautious ambition. Kennedy had led during a period of extraordinary tension without resorting to excess. He had emphasized preparation over performance, deliberation over impulse. His death did not convert those qualities into absolutes. It did, however, freeze them in time. The presidency he left behind was neither triumph nor failure. It was unfinished. In Dallas, the presidency ended not through electoral defeat or policy reversal, but through violence that cut across intention and planning. The implications would unfold over years, influencing how leadership, security, and public life were understood. The nation moved forward, but not unchanged. Kennedy's absence altered expectations and tone. The end of his presidency marked not only the loss of a leader, but the end of a particular moment in American political life. Legacy, memory, and historical weight. In the years following John Fitzgerald Kennedy's death, his presidency began to shift from lived experience into historical memory. This transition did not happen all at once. It unfolded gradually, shaped by mourning, political necessity, and the natural human tendency to search for meaning after abrupt loss. Kennedy's legacy was not fixed at the moment of his assassination. It was constructed over time, influenced by events that followed and by the perspectives of those who remembered him. In the immediate aftermath, attention focused on continuity. Lyndon B. Johnson moved quickly to stabilize the government and advance unfinished legislation. Many of Kennedy's proposals, particularly in civil rights and economic reform, were reframed as tributes to his vision. This framing was not merely symbolic. It reflected a desire to preserve momentum and reassure the public that leadership endured beyond individual lives. As policies enacted under Johnson took effect, Kennedy's role in shaping them was debated. Some initiatives were clearly rooted in his administration's work. Others evolved beyond his original intentions. Historians would later examine these continuities and divergences, seeking to understand where Kennedy's influence ended and subsequent leadership began. The Cold War context remained central to evaluations of Kennedy's presidency. His handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis was frequently cited as a defining moment. Scholars emphasized his restraint, willingness to consider alternatives, and capacity to manage advisors with differing views. These qualities were contrasted with more rigid approaches adopted elsewhere, reinforcing the image of Kennedy as a cautious steward in a dangerous era. At the same time, critics noted unresolved challenges. Vietnam, in particular, became a focal point of debate. Kennedy's intentions regarding future involvement were examined closely. Some argued that he would have avoided large-scale escalation. Others contended that structural pressures made deeper involvement likely regardless of leadership. The absence of definitive decisions allowed multiple interpretations to coexist. Civil rights formed another central element of Kennedy's historical assessment. His early caution and later advocacy were both scrutinized. Supporters emphasized the constraints he faced and the significance of his eventual legislative commitment. Critics questioned whether stronger action earlier might have accelerated progress. Over time, these debates highlighted the tension between moral clarity and political feasibility that defined his approach. Kennedy's image also became intertwined with broader cultural memory. His presidency coincided with the rise of television as a dominant medium, ensuring that his voice and appearance remained vivid in public consciousness. Speeches, press conferences, and moments of crisis were replayed, analysed, and remembered with clarity uncommon for earlier leaders. This visibility contributed to a sense of immediacy in memory. Kennedy did not feel distant or abstract. He remained present through recordings and images, shaping how subsequent generations encountered his presidency. This presence influenced interpretation, sometimes emphasizing tone and demeanor as much as policy. The concept of generational change became central to Kennedy's legacy. He was remembered as a young leader at a time when American leadership had been dominated by older figures shaped by earlier conflicts. His emphasis on education, science, and global responsibility reinforced this perception. The space program, in particular, came to symbolize forward-looking ambition grounded in effort rather than ideology. Yet Kennedy's legacy was not uniformly idealized. His private life, once carefully shielded, became the subject of later scrutiny. Biographies and archival research revealed complexities and contradictions. These revelations complicated public perception, prompting reassessment of character without negating achievement. This process of reassessment reflected a broader maturation in historical analysis. Rather than seeking heroes without flaw, scholars and readers became more willing to accept complexity. Kennedy's presidency was increasingly understood as a product of its time, shaped by structural forces as much as individual will. The assassination itself continued to exert influence on memory. The abruptness of his death froze his presidency in a particular moment. Unlike leaders who served longer terms, Kennedy did not experience the gradual erosion of popularity that often accompanies extended tenure. His image remained associated with possibility rather than decline. This phenomenon affected how his presidency was compared to others. Achievements were weighed against potential rather than outcome. Unfinished initiatives invited speculation. This speculative element became inseparable from his legacy, though it resisted definitive conclusion. Internationally, Kennedy's reputation remained largely positive. He was remembered as a leader who engaged with global responsibility thoughtfully, balancing strength with restraint. His efforts toward arms control and communication were seen as early steps toward reducing nuclear risk, even if they did not transform the global order. In developing nations, his emphasis on development and partnership left mixed impressions. Programs like the Alliance for Progress were acknowledged for intent, though results varied. Kennedy's approach to these regions was remembered as attentive but constrained by broader Cold War dynamics. The historical weight of his presidency also influenced how subsequent leaders framed their own roles. References to Kennedy appeared in speeches, policies, and symbolic gestures. His emphasis on service and responsibility became touchstones invoked during moments of challenge. Educational curricula incorporated his presidency as a case study in leadership under pressure. The Cuban Missile Crisis, in particular, became a central example of crisis management, examined for lessons about decision-making, communication, and restraint. Kennedy's writing, including Profiles in Courage, remained part of this educational legacy. Its focus on principle and consequence resonated with readers seeking to understand political ethics. While debates about authorship persisted, the ideas expressed continued to shape discussions about leadership. Over time, public memory evolved. Generations who had not lived through his presidency encountered Kennedy primarily through history rather than experience. Their understanding was mediated by scholarship, media, and cultural reference. This distance allowed for more nuanced evaluation, though it also softened emotional immediacy. The phrase often associated with Kennedy's presidency became less important than the substance of his actions. Historians focused increasingly on policy choices, institutional dynamics, and international context. Myth gave way, gradually, to analysis. Yet myth did not disappear entirely. Certain images retained symbolic power. The inaugural address, the space commitment, the calm response to crisis, these moments continued to represent ideals of leadership. They functioned less as literal templates than as reference points. Kennedy's legacy also influenced how Americans understood vulnerability. His assassination underscored the fragility of public life and the unpredictability of history. It prompted reassessment of security, public access, and the costs of openness. These considerations shaped subsequent presidencies. The emotional impact of his death lingered, particularly for those who had lived through it. For them, Kennedy's presidency remained associated with a sense of interruption. This emotional dimension coexisted with analytical assessment, adding depth to memory. As decades passed, archival materials became available, allowing historians to examine decision-making processes in detail. These records confirmed some perceptions and challenged others. They revealed a president deeply engaged with complexity, often uncertain yet committed to deliberation. This archival insight reinforced the understanding that Kennedy's leadership style was not instinctive or impulsive. It was learned, shaped by illness, war, and observation. The calm he projected was the result of discipline rather than ease. The weight of history thus settled unevenly. Kennedy's presidency was neither unqualified success nor missed opportunity alone. It was a moment of navigation through unprecedented challenges, marked by restraint and adaptation. In considering his complete life story, the continuity between early experience and presidential leadership becomes clear. The habits formed in childhood endurance, observation, restraint remained evident at the highest level of responsibility. The war reinforced these traits. Politics refined them. Kennedy's life did not follow a simple arc. It was shaped by contingency and constraint. Privilege opened doors. Illness imposed limits. History provided challenges. His response was measured rather than dramatic. The legacy he left behind reflects this balance. It resists simple classification. It invites ongoing examination rather than definitive judgment. In this sense, Kennedy remains a subject of study not because of what he represented symbolically, but because of how he engaged with complexity. The historical weight of his presidency lies not in resolution but in process. He demonstrated that leadership in a modern, interconnected world required patience, communication, and restraint. These lessons remain relevant beyond their original context. As time continues to pass, Kennedy's presidency occupies a stable place in historical understanding. It is no longer immediate, yet it remains influential. The questions it raises about power, responsibility, and uncertainty continue to resonate. In the end, Kennedy's life story does not conclude with closure. It concludes with interruption, followed by interpretation. His presidency became part of a larger narrative about the 20th century, its risks and its aspirations. The world he inhabited no longer exists in the same form, yet the challenges he faced, global tension, social change, technological acceleration, persist in new shapes. The manner in which he approached them remains instructive. Legacy, in this sense, is not about permanence. It is about influence over thought and approach. Kennedy's influence endures not because his presidency solved problems, but because it modelled a way of engaging with them. The historical weight of his life rests in this engagement. It invites reflection rather than certainty. It offers lessons without prescriptions. It remains, appropriately, unfinished.